Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History for Deep Rest. Tonight we wander into a world of white silence where the air itself seems to crack when you breathe and the ground answers every step with a soft, powdery sigh. You stand at the edge of a winter village, snow drifting in slow spirals around you, the sky pale and endless above. The trees are stripped bare, their branches creaking like old wooden ships in a frozen sea. There is no hum of electricity, no cheerful click of a thermostat. Only the long hush of winter and the faint ribbon of smoke rising from somewhere ahead. You probably would not survive this without central heating, a down jacket, rated for polar expeditions, and at least 3 weather apps open on your phone, but here centuries ago entire communities do more than survive, they live. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, tell me your location and local time. I always love imagining where in the world you are listening from. Now dim the lights. You step closer to the village. The snow is deep, yet the path beneath your feet feels strangely firm, almost intentional. It has been packed down by many feet, children and elders alike, moving back and forth between homes. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and something richer, perhaps drying meat or simmering broth. That smell is life itself in winter. It's a common historical understanding that many Native American communities were highly adapted to their specific environments, including extreme cold. This is not a romantic exaggeration. Archaeological evidence across North America shows winter settlements carefully placed and constructed to manage wind, snow, and scarce daylight. You are not witnessing improvisation, you are seeing design. The first shock is how calm everything feels. You expect desperation. Instead, you sense rhythm. A dog lifts its head as you pass, its breath fogging gently. Somewhere you hear the dull thud of wood being split. The sound is steady, unhurried. Wood is currency here. Firewood is tomorrow's warmth stacked neatly against today's wall. You rub your hands together, already missing your imaginary radiator. Without heating, you assume winter means constant misery. Yet historians still argue whether the phrase without heating is even fair. There is heating. It just does not come from cast iron radiators or electric coils. It comes from fire, from bodies from Earth itself. The difference is not absence, it is method. You notice that the homes are not scattered randomly. They cluster in a way that feels protective, almost intimate. Each structure seems to lean slightly inward, as if bracing against the wind together. The placement is no accident. Across various regions, communities often oriented entrances away from prevailing winter winds, reducing the bite of icy gusts that could steal warmth in seconds. You stand in the open for a moment and feel how sharp the air is on your cheeks. Now imagine that same wind funneled directly into your doorway every time you stepped outside. Orientation matters. A faint memory of a quirky detail floats through your mind. In some northern communities, people were known to test the thickness of ice not just by sight but by listening to its tone when struck. A deeper sound suggested greater thickness. It sounds almost musical, like winter humming back. Survival sometimes depends on ears as much as eyes. You approach one dwelling. Its exterior is textured, layered, not smooth like a suburban wall. You reach out and press your gloved hand against it. The surface is cold, of course, but solid. Beneath that exterior, insulation waits. Earth sod-packed snow or layered hides, depending on the region. Materials chosen not for beauty but for thermal logic. You begin to understand that heating is not only about producing warmth, it is about refusing to let warmth escape. Your breath slows, the sky begins to dim toward late afternoon even though it feels like morning. Winter days are short, especially farther north. You imagine living by this light, measuring tasks by the arc of a sun that barely climbs above the horizon. Time feels different here, slower, thicker. There is another widely accepted fact that settles gently into your thoughts. Many indigenous groups developed seasonal rounds, moving locations throughout the year to take advantage of resources. Winter was not a surprise attack. It was an anticipated chapter. Preparations began months earlier, in the abundance of summer and the crisp productivity of autumn. Food was dried, smoked, rendered into fat-rich stores. Clothing was stitched carefully, seams tightened against drafts. You do not wait for the first snowfall to wonder what you will eat. A door flap lifts, and a wave of warmer air brushes your face. Not hot, but undeniably softer than the outside. Inside figures move in low light. You catch the flicker of flame somewhere deeper within. The interior smells of smoke, fur, and something savoury. Your shoulders drop without you meaning them to. Even your body recognizes shelter. You might assume that life inside is cramped and bleak. Yet as your eyes adjust, you notice order, tools placed deliberately, sleeping areas arranged with thought, a central space that seems to revolve around the fire. Fire is not decoration, it is heartbeat. Scholars continue to debate how warm these interiors truly were during the coldest months. Some experimental reconstructions suggest surprisingly moderate temperatures when insulation and small steady fires work together. Others argue that comfort was relative, shaped by bodies acclimated from birth to colder baselines. You with your climate-controlled expectations might shiver. They, accustomed to the rhythm of seasons, might simply feel winter as winter. You crouch near the fire. The heat is gentle, radiating in waves that reach your palms. The smoke curls upward, finding its way through an opening designed to vent it without inviting too much cold air inside. Engineering without blueprints, trial and error refined over generations. Outside, the wind rises, briefly pressing against the walls with a low moan. You tense instinctively. The structure does not. It absorbs the sound, grounded in earth, low to the land. You realize something quietly profound. Survival here is not about conquering winter. It is about cooperating with it, using its materials, respecting its force, preparing long before it arrives. You sit back on your heels and listen to the murmur of voices. A child laughs softly. Someone stirs a pot. The fire pops a small spark, flaring and dying in the same breath. There is no thermostat to adjust, no button to press. Only knowledge practiced and passed down. And as you settle into this first evening in the frozen silence, you begin to sense that the question is not, how did they survive without heating? It is, how did they redefine heating entirely? The answer will unfold slowly like smoke, drifting toward the roof as you move deeper into this winter world. You remain crouched near the fire, letting your eyes adjust fully to the interior. The warmth is not dramatic. It does not blast against your skin. Instead, it gathers quietly, settling into your clothes, your hair, the very air you breathe. When you shift your weight, you notice the floor beneath you is not frozen solid. It feels firm but not icy. That detail alone begins to reshape your assumptions. You rise slowly and study the structure more carefully. From the outside, it appeared modest, almost understated against the snow. Inside, however, you see intention in every curve and seam. The walls are thick, not decorative thick, strategic thick. Layers of earth, sodwood, or packed snow create a barrier that slows the escape of heat. You run your hand along the interior surface and sense the subtle difference between outside cold and inside retention. It is not about overpowering winter. It is about resisting it patiently. Across the continent, different communities perfected different designs. In the Arctic, the Inuit constructed igloos from blocks of snow, shaped into domes that seem delicate but are structurally brilliant. It is a well-established historical fact that snow, when compacted, contains tiny air pockets that trap heat, acting as insulation. You glance upward and imagine a snow dome holding in warmth from body heat and a small oil lamp. It sounds improbable until you remember how your own winter coat works. Air held still becomes a shield. Farther south on the plains, earth lodges rise low and rounded from the ground, built partly below the surface. The earth itself becomes insulation. Soil does not change temperature as quickly as air. By tucking a home partially into the ground, families stabilize the interior climate. You picture yourself descending slightly into such a lodge, stepping down into a space that feels protected rather than exposed. The wind may howl above, but down here it becomes a distant complaint. In the eastern woodlands, longhouses stretch lengthwise, housing multiple families under one roof. Thick bark panels line the exterior. Inside, the central hearths dot the length of the structure, each serving a cluster of people. Smoke drifts upward toward openings in the roof, but the structure's length and interior partitions slow the rush of cold air. You stand in the middle of this imagined space and feel how communal warmth gathers, spreading from one hearth to the next. Experts continue to debate which of these structures retained heat most efficiently during prolonged cold snaps. Experimental archaeology has attempted reconstructions lighting small fires inside replicas and measuring temperature changes. Some findings suggest that even in sub-zero conditions, interiors could remain significantly warmer than the outside air, especially when filled with people. Others argue that comfort depended heavily on maintenance and constant attention. You can almost hear the quiet, scholarly arguments drifting like smoke across conference rooms far removed from this snowbound village. You walk toward the entrance and examine it more closely. It is small. You instinctively want to straighten your back and stride out, but the doorway forces you to bend. That inconvenience is deliberate. Smaller openings mean less heat lost each time someone enters or leaves. In some Arctic dwellings, entrances were built as low tunnels that dipped downward before rising into the main chamber. Cold air settles in the lower tunnel while warmer air remains above in the living space. It is simple physics. It is also elegant. A lesser-known tidbit flickers in your mind. Some communities lined parts of their dwellings with animal skins, not just for comfort, but to reduce drafts and trap additional warmth. Fur side inward, creating a soft barrier that holds heat close to the body. It is almost like lining your walls with living blankets. You brush your hand against a hanging hide and feel its thickness. The faint scent of animal and smoke lingers earthy and reassuring. You notice how low the ceiling feels compared to modern homes. There is no cavernous open plan here. No soaring atrium meant to impress guests. Lower ceilings mean less vertical space for warm air to drift away from human reach. In your own house, heat rises towards ceilings you rarely touch. Here the design keeps warmth within arm's length. You stretch upward and nearly graze the beams. It feels intimate, efficient, intentional. Outside the wind shifts direction, pressing against another side of the dwelling. The structure does not creak in panic. It absorbs the pressure. Many winter homes were built with rounded shapes rather than sharp corners, allowing wind to slide around rather than strike directly. You imagine standing in a square box during a blizzard versus standing in a dome. One resists, the other deflects. You step closer to the wall and listen. The outside world sounds muted as though wrapped in cotton. Snow piled against exterior walls acts as additional insulation even when not deliberately placed there. Some groups intentionally banked snow around their homes to thicken this protective layer. Snow which you might see only as obstacle becomes ally. The idea feels almost rebellious against your modern instinct to shovel it away immediately. There is another broadly recognized fact that settles into your understanding. Many native communities built winter homes separate from their summer dwellings. Winter houses were often sturdier, more enclosed, designed specifically for cold weather. Summer structures could be lighter, more open to breezes. Seasonal architecture. You find yourself admiring that flexibility. Instead of forcing one design to work all year, they shifted with the seasons. You kneel near the hearth again and look up toward the smoke hole. It is not simply a gap. It is positioned to allow smoke to escape while minimizing the intake of cold air. In some structures, coverings could be adjusted depending on wind direction. It reminds you of adjusting a window just slightly rather than flinging it wide open. Small calibrations, constant awareness. Some researchers have questioned how smoky these interiors truly were, suggesting that long exposure to indoor smoke might have affected respiratory health. Others propose that ventilation techniques were more refined than previously assumed, reducing prolonged buildup. The truth likely varies by region and era. You imagine generations refining placement and airflow through experienced learning from discomfort, adjusting quietly over time. You sit back and let the scene settle. The firelight dances along curved walls. Shadows move gently like slow breathing. You realize that heating here is not a single object, not a metal stove dominating a room. It is architecture material science, communal design and intimate knowledge of wind and snow. You press your palm once more against the wall. Outside winter reigns with crisp authority. Inside warmth lingers, not lavish but sufficient. And you begin to understand that survival is less about fighting cold with overwhelming force and more about shaping space so that even a small flame becomes enough. You lean a little closer to the hearth and the fire answers with a soft crackle, as if pleased by your attention. The flames are not towering. They are not the roaring bonfire of a camping trip meant for dramatic effect. They are steady, deliberate, almost restrained. And that restraint is the point. You watch as someone adjusts a log with a stick, nudging it inward just enough to keep the embers glowing. Fire here is not spectacle. It is companion. It is responsibility. It is the quiet center around which everything else revolves. It's widely recognized that controlled fire was essential to winter survival across Indigenous North America. Hearths were often positioned at the heart of the dwelling, serving not only for warmth but for cooking, drying clothing, hardening tools, and even social gathering. You feel the truth of that as you extend your hands toward the glow. The heat reaches you in waves, touching your knuckles first, then your palms, then seeping slowly into your sleeves. You notice how small the fire actually is, compared to what you might build on a chilly evening in your backyard. That is not stinginess, it is skill. A large blaze consumes fuel quickly and wastes heat that rises too fast. A modest, carefully maintained fire produces consistent warmth over many hours. You imagine the mental arithmetic behind it. How much wood is left? How long until dawn? How cold the night is expected to become? Outside wood is stacked neatly against the dwelling. Each piece has been split and dried long before snow sealed the ground. Gathering firewood in winter is possible, but it is far harder. Preparation begins months earlier. That is a well-documented reality of seasonal living. Summer labour quietly fuels winter comfort. A faint scent of resin drifts from the burning logs, perhaps pine. The smoke curls upward, not in chaotic plumes, but in a steady ribbon that finds its way to the vent above. You squint slightly, feeling a thin sting in your eyes. It is not unbearable, just present, a reminder that warmth here is earned. There is a curious detail that lingers in historical accounts. In some Arctic communities, oil lamps fueled by seal or whale fat provided not only light but meaningful heat inside snow houses. The flame was small, almost delicate, yet in a well-insulated igloo, even that modest source could raise the temperature significantly. You picture a shallow stone lamp, its wick glowing softly, casting golden light against white walls of packed snow. The contrast feels almost magical. You shift your weight and listen to the rhythm of the fire. Pop, crackle, a soft sigh as a log settles. It sounds alive. No wonder many cultures treated fire with reverence. It transforms cold wood into warmth and light. It demands respect. Left untended, it can vanish or destroy. Some scholars continue to debate how frequently fires were kept burning through the night. Was someone always awake to tend the embers, or did families rely on thick insulation and banked coals to last until morning? The answer likely differed from place to place. You imagine the quiet vigilance of someone rising in the dark, adding a small piece of wood, ensuring that the glow never fades entirely. You lean closer and feel the heat strongest near the ground. That surprises you. In your modern home, warm air rises towards ceilings far above. Here, with low roofs and compact space, the warmth circulates differently. Bodies sit close together. The fire is central. Heat radiates outward, caught by walls designed to hold it. You notice stones arranged around the hearth. They absorb warmth slowly and release it gradually, even after flames die down. It is a simple form of thermal mass. You place your hand near one and feel its stored heat steady and reassuring. It is like leaning against a sun-warmed rock in late afternoon, except outside is nothing but ice. There is another commonly accepted fact that settles gently into your understanding. Fire was not only practical but social. Winter nights are long, especially in northern regions where daylight dwindles to a few pale hours. The hearth becomes a place of storytelling, teaching, and quiet companionship. You imagine voices weaving through the dim light, elders recounting histories, children listening wide-eyed as sparks rise like tiny stars. A small, almost whimsical detail crosses your mind. Some groups use specific woods for different purposes, knowing which burned hotter, which smoked less, which lasted longer as coals. It was not random. It was intimate knowledge of trees gathered over generations. You wonder how many modern people could identify the best firewood in their own region without checking a search engine. The wind outside presses briefly against the structure, and you hear it through the walls as a low murmur. The fire answers with a brighter flicker as if asserting its presence. You feel caught between two forces, the vast cold beyond the walls and this contained sun at your knees. You glance toward the entrance. Each time someone slips in or out, the fire becomes even more precious. A gust of cold air sneaks in, swirling around ankles before being slowly warmed. The smaller the opening, the less intrusion. You remember how the doorway forced you to bend. Now you appreciate that inconvenience. Researchers still discuss the long-term health effects of indoor fires in enclosed spaces. Some argue that smoke exposure posed challenges. Others note that ventilation systems, even simple ones, reduced much of the danger. The balance between warmth and air quality was another equation solved through experience rather than textbooks. You watch as the person tending the hearth uses a stick to gather embers together, creating a concentrated glow. There is no frantic motion, just patience. Fire here is not an afterthought. It is a living presence that requires care. Neglect it and you face a bitter dawn. Feed it too eagerly and you waste tomorrow's fuel. You stretch your hands one last time and let the warmth seep into your skin. You realize that without a metal stove or central heating unit, warmth still radiates through this space. It is shaped by architecture, moderated by fuel, amplified by human proximity. And as the flames settle into a steady pulse, you begin to sense that this hearth is more than survival. It is continuity. It connects winter to summer, preparation to comfort, knowledge to practice. You sit in its glow, aware that outside the cold is endless, but here at the center a small sun burns faithfully on. You shift away from the hearth and become aware of something else entirely. The warmth you feel is not coming only from the fire. It is wrapped around you, draped over shoulders and legs, stitched carefully into every fold of clothing. You glance down at your sleeves and imagine them replaced with thick hide supple and strong-lined with fur that brushes softly against your skin. In this world, clothing is not fashion, it is architecture you wear. A broadly accepted historical reality is that many Native American communities crafted winter garments from animal skins chosen specifically for their insulating properties: caribou, deer, buffalo, seal, rabbit. Each offered different advantages depending on climate and availability. You imagine yourself pulling on a parka made from caribou hide, the hollow hairs trapping air and holding warmth close to your body. It is less like putting on a jacket and more like stepping inside a portable shelter. You reach out and touch a folded robe near the sleeping area. The fur is dense, soft, but resilient. It smells faintly of smoke and earth. That scent is not unpleasant. It is grounding. These materials are not synthetic barriers against the cold, they are part of the landscape itself, reshaped into protection. You consider how you dress in winter. Layers of factory-produced fabric zipped and buttoned in haste. Here layering is deliberate and precise. A soft inner layer to wick moisture away from skin. A thicker insulating layer. An outer layer to block wind and snow. Long before modern outdoor brands marketed the concept of three-layer systems, this principle was understood through lived experience. Some researchers continue to examine how sophisticated these garments were in terms of tailoring and thermal efficiency. Surviving examples and early accounts describe fitted sleeves, carefully sewn seams, and hoods designed to reduce exposed skin. It was not crude wrapping, it was engineering with needle and sinew. You imagine the process of making such clothing. Hides must be scraped, cleaned, stretched, softened. Brain tanning, a method used widely, involves working animal brains into the hide to create supple, durable leather. It sounds unusual to modern ears, yet it produces remarkably flexible material. You picture hands working patiently over a stretched skin, rubbing, twisting, pulling, until stiffness gives way to softness. There is a small and rather charming detail that sometimes appears in ethnographic notes. In certain northern communities, mittens were preferred over gloves because keeping fingers together conserves heat more effectively. You smile at the simplicity of that insight. Your own winter gloves suddenly feel less advanced. You pull an imaginary hood over your head and feel how it narrows your field of vision, slightly focusing your gaze forward. Around your face, fur trim disrupts the wind, creating a pocket of slightly warmer air as you breathe. You exhale slowly and watch the vapor drift outward, caught briefly in that halo of fur before vanishing. The cold outside is not merely low temperature. It is wind moisture, prolonged exposure. Clothing must address all three. Snow clings to fabric differently than it does to treated hide. A smooth outer surface allows snow to brush away rather than melt and refreeze. Wetness is dangerous here. Damp cloth draws heat from the body with quiet efficiency. There remains discussion among historians about how clothing styles varied in response to particularly severe winters or shifts in climate. During colder periods, did garments become thicker or layered differently? Material culture suggests adaptability, though. Exact details are sometimes elusive. You imagine elders observing changing weather patterns and adjusting techniques accordingly. You notice that even footwear is intentional. Soft moccasins lined with fur, sometimes worn with additional grass or fur stuffing for insulation. In Arctic regions, boots made from sealskin or caribou hide are constructed with waterproof outer layers and insulating inner linings. Your toes, which tend to go numb after a short winter walk, suddenly appreciate the ingenuity involved. The stitching itself is worth a pause. Sinew dried and split into fine thread swells slightly when damp sealing seams more tightly against moisture. That subtle characteristic transforms simple thread into a kind of weatherproofing. You run your finger along a seam and imagine the quiet satisfaction of knowing that even your stitches work with the environment rather than against it. It is another well-established point that clothing was often decorated with beadwork, quillwork, or painted designs even in harsh climates. Function did not eliminate beauty. You consider that for a moment. In a world where survival depends on warmth, there is still room for artistry. Patterns stitched into sleeves, colours contrasting against snow. It suggests that winter endurance is not joyless. You sit back and observe how people move within the dwelling. Garments are adjusted, loosened slightly near the fire, tightened again before stepping outside. Nothing is static. Clothing is managed as actively as the hearth. You feel a gentle admiration growing. There is also quiet debate about how early European observers interpreted Indigenous winter dress. Some accounts exaggerated supposed hardship, misunderstanding materials and techniques unfamiliar to them. Modern studies of surviving garments have revealed craftsmanship that rivals specialized cold weather gear today. You imagine historians leaning over preserved parkas in museum collections, marveling at the precision of cuts and seams. You wrap an imagined robe around your shoulders and let it settle. The weight is comforting, not cumbersome. It presses warmth inward, creating a small climate that travels with you. Even if the fire dims, even if you must step into the biting air, your body carries its own defense. You realize now that heating is not confined to walls and hearths. It is stitched into sleeves tied around waists, laced around ankles. It is chosen animal by animal, fiber by fiber. It is knowledge passed from parent to child, refined through winters long before yours. And as you flex your fingers inside thick mittens and feel the steady warmth held there, you begin to sense how survival in freezing months is less about resisting the cold outright and more about shaping a second skin that keeps it gently at bay. You sit again near the hearth, wrapped in your imagined layers, and become aware of a different kind of warmth spreading through you. Not from flame, not from fur, from food. A wooden bowl is passed into your hands, steam curling upward in slow fragrant spirals. The scent is rich, savoury, faintly sweet. You did not realize how hungry you were until now. In freezing conditions, the body is a furnace that must be fed constantly. One widely acknowledged historical reality is that many Native American winter diets were intentionally high in fat and protein, providing dense calories that sustained energy and internal heat. You lift the bowl closer to your face and inhale deeply. Broth made from bones simmered for hours, bits of dried meat rehydrated and softened. Perhaps ground corn stirred in to thicken it. This is not delicate cuisine, it is fuel. You take a careful sip. The liquid is hot enough to sting your lips at first, then settle warmly down your throat. You feel it reach your stomach and spread outward, subtle but undeniable. It's a quiet fire kindled within. Across northern regions, rendered animal fat played a critical role in winter survival. Pemmican, for example, combined dried meat pounded into fine fibers with melted fat and sometimes berries. Pressed together, it formed a dense, portable food that could last for months. You imagine biting into a small piece, surprised at how compact something so powerful can be. A few mouthfuls could carry you through hours of cold labour. There remains thoughtful discussion among historians about how widely pemmican and similar preparations were shared between different groups before extensive trade networks expanded. Some evidence suggests regional variations developed independently, shaped by available animals and climate demands. You picture communities refining recipes over generations, adjusting ratios of fat to meat depending on how severe the winters tended to be. The bowl in your hands empties gradually. You notice that no one eats hurriedly. Food is valued. It is prepared with care long before snow blankets the land. Summer and autumn are seasons of gathering, hunting, drying, smoking. Berries are laid out in the sun. Gisush are hung over slow fires. Corn is harvested and stored. Winter meals are months in the making. You recall a small but intriguing detail from ethnographic records. In some regions, marrow extracted from bones was considered especially nourishing during cold months. Children might be given marrow as a treat, its richness both delicious and sustaining. You imagine cracking open a bone beside the hearth, scooping out the soft centre with a carved utensil, savouring the taste while sit snow piles silently outside. You feel your pulse, steady warmth blooming beneath your ribs. It becomes clear that heating is not solely external. Metabolism itself becomes an ally. The body burns calories to maintain its core temperature. Without sufficient food, even the best clothing and architecture cannot prevent decline. Another well-established fact emerges gently. Many communities relied on a balanced winter diet that included not only meat but stored plant foods rich in carbohydrates and vitamins. Dried squash beans, corn, wild rice. These staples provided variety and essential nutrients that prevented deficiencies during months when fresh greens were scarce. You glance at a woven container near the wall and imagine it filled with carefully dried kernels, each one a small promise made during harvest season. Outside, the wind carries a faint, distant howl. You feel insulated from it now, not only by walls and garments, but by the slow burn inside you. Your shoulders relax further. There is ongoing academic conversation about how climate fluctuations affected food storage strategies over centuries. During particularly harsh periods, did communities shift toward greater reliance on preserved animal fats? Did colder cycles require larger communal hunts before winter arrived? The answers are complex and vary widely across regions. You sense the weight of that adaptability. Survival was never static. You watch as another pot is stirred near the fire. The lid lifts briefly, releasing a wave of scent that fills the dwelling. It smells of smoked meat and something faintly herbal. perhaps dried leaves added for flavour or health. You realise that meals here are not only about calories, they are about morale, sitting together, sharing stories between bites, the psychological warmth of community. A charming observation surfaces in your mind. Early European visitors sometimes remarked with surprise at the richness of indigenous winter stews, noting the generous use of fat compared to their own diets. What one culture might label excessive, another understands as essential. You smile softly at the thought of culinary misunderstandings carried across frozen landscapes. You imagine stepping outside after eating. The cold still bites your cheeks, but it no longer feels as penetrating. Your body radiates subtle heat, muscles feel stronger, fingers less stiff. Internal warmth does not eliminate winter, it fortifies you against it. You glance toward the stored supplies along the wall. Bundles of dried fish hang from rafters. Sealed containers sit elevated to protect from moisture and pests. Every item represents foresight. Months earlier, someone stood in summer sunlight slicing meat into thin strips, turning them carefully to dry evenly. Someone else gathered berries until the fingers were stained purple. Preparation is the quiet partner of winter survival. There is still discussion among scholars about the precise caloric intake required in extreme northern winters and how closely traditional diets met those demands. Modern nutritional analysis of preserved recipes suggests impressive balance, though exact figures remain debated. You imagine researchers poring over historical accounts calculating fat content while snow falls gently outside their university windows. You set your empty bowl aside and feel a comfortable heaviness settle in your limbs. Not sluggishness, contentment. The fire glows steadily, the walls hold firm, your clothing rests warmly against your skin. And as you sit in that layered warmth, you understand that heating is not merely flame in a hearth. It is food rendered and stored with intention. It is knowledge of which animals to hunt and which plants to dry. It is the steady partnership between land labour and body. Outside winter stretches endlessly across the landscape. Inside nourishment transforms cold into something survivable, even manageable. You draw a slow breath and let it out gently, aware that in this world every meal is both comfort and quiet triumph over the freeze. You finish your meal and rise carefully, pushing aside the heavy door covering to step back into the open air. The cold greets you immediately, crisp and alert, brushing your face like a firm reminder of where you are. Snow stretches in every direction, luminous beneath a pale sky. It looks hostile at first glance, endless white, endless chill, and yet as you stand there you begin to realize that snow itself is not the enemy you once imagined. You kneel and scoop up a handful. It squeaks faintly under pressure, dry and powdery. When packed together, it clings, forming a firm shape in your gloved palm. It feels paradoxical to think of something so cold as protective, but snow is full of trapped air. And trapped air, as you are slowly learning, is warmth waiting to happen. It is a well-documented reality that snow has remarkable insulating properties. In Arctic regions, snow houses were built entirely from compacted blocks cut with careful precision and arranged in spirals that form domed shelters. Inside such a structure, even a small heat source from body warmth or an oil lamp could raise the temperature dramatically compared to the outside air. You imagine yourself stepping into a white chamber carved from frozen ground, expecting unbearable cold, only to feel a surprising softness in the air. You glance around the village and notice how snow has drifted up against the outer walls of the dwellings. No one has shoveled it away. It is left there intentionally. Snow banked against a structure acts like an extra blanket thickening the barrier between interior warmth and exterior frost. What you might see as obstruction is quietly performing its duty. You take a few careful steps away from the homes, feeling the snow compress beneath your boots. Each step makes a faint crunch sharp in the stillness. The air smells clean, almost metallic. You notice a small mound nearby, not large enough to be a dwelling, but shaped deliberately. It could be a temporary windbreak or storage covered by snow. In some communities, pits dug into the ground and lined with insulating materials were covered in snow to preserve food at stable temperatures. Snow again becoming ally rather than threat. There remains thoughtful academic discussion about how consistently snow insulation was used across different regions. In the far north it was central. In more temperate areas it was supplemental, combined with earth and wood. The strategies shifted with geography, yet the principle remained. Use what winter provides to survive winter itself. You pause and listen. The world is astonishingly quiet. Snow absorbs sound, muffling distant movement. It creates a kind of acoustic insulation as well. The village feels cocooned, wrapped not only in physical protection but in hush. Even the wind seems gentler when it skims over snowdrifts rather than striking bare ground. A small and rather fascinating detail drifts through your thoughts. Some Arctic travellers would build emergency snow shelters when caught in sudden storms, carving out hollows in deep drifts to create temporary refuge. The idea of digging into snow for warmth feels counterintuitive, yet in desperate moments it could mean survival. You imagine pressing yourself into such a hollow body heat, slowly warming the enclosed space while blizzard winds roar harmlessly above. You crouch and press your hand against a drift that leans against one of the dwellings. The outer layer is icy, hardened by the wind. Beneath it the snow is softer, less compacted. Layers within layers. You think of it like insulation bats in modern walls, though here no factory assembled it. The storm itself delivered the materials. Another widely accepted point emerges gently. Many indigenous communities developed a nuanced understanding of snow conditions, distinguishing between types that packed well and those that did not, between safe surfaces and hidden dangers. Snow was not a single substance, but a range of textures and behaviours. You glance toward the horizon and wonder how many variations your untrained eye would miss. The sky begins to dim slightly as clouds gather. Snowflakes start to fall, light at first, then steadier. They brush against your hood and melt faintly against the warmth near your face. You tilt your head upward and let a few land on your eyelashes. They vanish almost instantly. There is ongoing conversation among historians about how climate fluctuations, including colder phases often grouped under what is sometimes called the Little Ice Age, may have influenced winter building techniques and snow usage. Did heavier snowfall encourage greater reliance on snow insulation? Did shifting temperatures alter settlement patterns? The answers are layered, much like the drifts around you. You walk back toward the dwelling and notice how the entrance is partially shielded by a natural curve of snow. It forms a gentle barrier against direct wind. You step inside again, brushing loose flakes from your shoulders. The transition from bright white glare to warm firelight feels almost dreamlike. You realize now that snow is not merely backdrop. It is material, it is structure. It is silent partner in a complex dance of survival. Without it, certain forms of shelter would not function as effectively. Without it, the landscape would be harsher in different ways. You settle once more near the hearth, watching as someone adjusts a hide near the entrance to block a draft. Snow continues to fall outside, thickening the insulating layer around the village. The fire glows steadily, reflecting faintly on damp boots left near the warmth to dry, and as you let your gaze soften, you begin to appreciate the quiet intelligence in embracing winter's own offerings. Snow may freeze rivers and blanket forests, but it also cradles homes, muffles storms, and holds warmth close when shaped with care. You draw a slow breath and feel the layered protection surrounding you. Earth below, snow without, fire within. Clothing against skin, food in your belly, each element working with the others, none standing alone. Outside flakes drift down in patient silence. Inside warmth persists, held gently in place by the very substance that once seemed so unforgiving. You shift your position closer to the sleeping area as the evening deepens. The fire has been banked slightly lower, now glowing rather than blazing its light softer and more golden. Around you, people begin to settle in for the night. Blankets are unrolled, robes are adjusted. The quiet murmur of conversation fades into something slower, almost like the gentle hum before sleep overtakes a room. You notice first how close everyone lies to one another. There are no separate bedrooms, no carefully spaced beds with polite distance between them. Instead, sleeping places are arranged deliberately, near the warmest part of the dwelling, often radiating outward from the hearth. It feels intimate, practical, entirely unself-conscious. It is well established that communal sleeping was a significant survival strategy during winter months in many indigenous communities. Shared body heat makes a measurable difference in enclosed spaces, especially when nights stretch long and temperatures plunge. You ease yourself down among the furs and feel warmth lingering in the layers beneath you. The surface is thick insulated not only by material but by the presence of others. You draw a robe around your shoulders and settle onto your side. Someone shifts slightly beside you, adjusting their position so that shoulders and backs align. There is nothing awkward about it. This is how you conserve heat. Your modern instinct for personal space feels almost excessive here. Warmth is collective. The fire pops softly and embers shift, casting small shadows that dance across the curved walls. The air feels warmer near the ground than you might expect. Low ceilings and careful insulation keep the heat circulating within reach. You stretch your legs slightly and feel another pair of feet brush yours under the blankets. The contact is brief, comfortable, and then still. There remains thoughtful academic discussion about how much interior temperature increased simply from human presence. Some experimental reconstructions of winter dwellings have suggested that a group of people resting together could raise the temperature significantly, even without a roaring fire. Others caution that results vary depending on materials and outside conditions. You imagine scholars measuring heat levels inside replicas, while bundled in parkas scribbling notes as frost gathers outside. A small, almost tender detail surfaces in your mind. In certain Arctic communities, infants were often placed in specially designed carriers or bedding arrangements that kept them close to adult bodies during sleep, ensuring consistent warmth through the night. You picture a child nestled securely between layers of fur, breathing softly, protected not only by walls and fire but by living warmth on all sides. You listen to the subtle sounds of the room, slow breathing, the rustle of hide as someone turns slightly, the faint sigh of wind outside. The absence of mechanical noise is striking. No heating system clicks on, no vent hums. Warmth here does not arrive in cycles. It lingers steadily, held by bodies and materials alike. Another widely accepted historical point drifts gently through your thoughts. Many winter dwellings were designed with raised sleeping platforms or insulated bedding areas to prevent direct contact with frozen ground. Even when floors were earthen layers of grass, reeds, or hides, created a barrier between skin and soil. You reach beneath you and feel the thickness of what separates you from the cold below. It is not luxurious, but it is intentional. You pull the robe higher around your neck and exhale slowly. The air feels less biting now. The combined heat of many bodies creates a pocket of comfort that would not exist if each person slept alone. You realize how different this feels from a solitary modern bedroom. There is security in proximity, a shared resilience. There is also quiet scholarly conversation about how social structures influence sleeping arrangements. Did status or age determine proximity to the hearth? Were elders placed in the warmest areas? Evidence suggests variation across cultures, yet warmth was often allocated thoughtfully, ensuring those most vulnerable were protected. You imagine a grandmother lying closest to the fire, her years honoured not only in story but in placement. The embers glow brighter for a moment as someone gently stirs them, perhaps ensuring they will last through the coldest hours before dawn. You watch the sparks rise and fade like tiny fireflies trapped indoors. You consider your own sleeping habits. A mattress engineered with coils and foam, a duvet with a specific temperature rating, a thermostat adjusted to personal preference. Here warmth is not individualized, it is shared. It requires cooperation and awareness. A curious detail that occasionally appears in accounts is that some communities used heated stones placed carefully near sleeping areas to provide additional warmth through the night. Stones warmed by the fire could release heat, gradually supplementing body warmth and embers. You imagine reaching towards such a stone in the dark, feeling its stored warmth like a quiet companion. The room grows quieter now. Conversations taper into murmurs, then into silence. The fire settles into a steady red glow. You feel the gentle rise and fall of breathing around you, a rhythm that becomes almost hypnotic. You realize that communal sleeping is not only about conserving heat, it is about reinforcing bonds. During long winters, when daylight is scarce and travel limited, proximity fosters connection. Stories shared before sleep linger in the mind. Laughter from earlier in the evening echoes faintly in memory. Outside, the snow continues to fall, thickening the insulating blanket around the dwelling. The wind brushes against the walls but does not intrude. Inside, warmth accumulates slowly, held by design and by togetherness. You close your eyes briefly and feel how the cold that once felt so sharp now seems distant, softened by layers of fur and human presence. Heating here is not a machine. It is a circle of bodies arranged carefully around a glowing centre. And as sleep edges closer, you sense that survival in these freezing months is woven as much from shared breath as from firewood or snow walls. The night stretches long, but you are not alone within it. Morning arrives quietly, not with a burst of light, but with a gradual thinning of darkness. You open your eyes and see the faintest grey seeping through the smoke vent above. The fire has settled into a bed of embers, still alive, still breathing softly. Around you, bodies stir, robes shift. Someone coughs gently and sits up to coax the coals back into flame. You rise carefully, feeling the lingering warmth where everyone slept close together. Outside, the world is pale and wind brushed the snow, newly sculpted into subtle ridges. It looks still, but you already sense movement beneath that stillness. Winter survival is not only about sheltering in place. Sometimes it means knowing when to move. It's a widely recognized feature of many indigenous cultures across North America. that seasonal migration formed part of a carefully organised yearly cycle. Communities did not always remain in a single settlement throughout the year. Instead, they followed a seasonal round, relocating to areas better suited for winter conditions or resource availability. You step outside and imagine the preparations required to shift an entire community before snow grows too deep. In some regions, winter camps were established in wooded valleys where trees provided natural wind protection and access thus to firewood was very reliable. Open summer plains might offer rich hunting grounds in warmer months, but winter winds there could be punishing. You picture families moving deliberately in late autumn, transporting supplies, dismantling lighter structures, reinforcing sturdier winter homes in sheltered terrain. There is thoughtful discussion among historians regarding how fixed or flexible these seasonal movements were. Did certain groups follow identical routes each year, almost like a ritual? Or did climate variability demand constant adaptation? Evidence suggests both patterns existed. Some paths were deeply traditional, shaped by generations of knowledge. Others shifted when game populations moved or winters grew harsher than expected. You imagine yourself walking in a line across early snowfall, following tracks laid by those ahead. Snowshoes strapped to your feet distribute your weight, preventing you from sinking too deeply. Without them, travel would be exhausting and slow. With them, you move steadily, even gracefully across terrain that would otherwise trap you. A small yet fascinating detail surfaces in your mind. Among some northern communities, sled dogs were not only companions but essential partners in winter relocation. Harnessed together, they pulled loads across frozen ground and sea ice. You can almost hear the rhythmic crunch of paws and runners gliding over packed snow. The breath of the dogs steams in the cold air, their energy transforming a difficult journey into something possible. You glance back toward the village and imagine it half dismantled, certain items packed carefully, others left behind if return is expected in spring. Mobility requires strategy. You cannot carry everything. Choices must be made about what is essential. It's well documented that in many regions, winter camps were positioned closer to reliable sources of food, such as sheltered hunting grounds or fishing sites that remained accessible despite freezing conditions. You picture a frozen river where ice fishing becomes possible, or forested areas where animals seek cover from wind, making them easier to track. Winter reshapes the map, revealing new routes and hiding others. Scholars continue to examine how climate shifts over centuries influenced migration patterns. During colder intervals, some communities may have adjusted routes or consolidated settlements to conserve resources. Archaeological findings sometimes reveal layers of occupation that hint at changing strategies, though the full story is rarely simple. You imagine researchers brushing snow from excavation sites, tracing patterns that once guided entire populations. You feel the bite of air on your cheeks as you walk a short distance beyond the dwellings. The cold seems sharper in open space, and it becomes clear why wooded areas are prized in winter. Trees break the wind, catch drifting snow, create microclimates where temperatures feel slightly less severe. You pause beneath a stand of evergreens and notice how much quieter it feels here compared to exposed ground. There is another firmly established point worth considering. Seasonal movement was not random wandering. It was guided by deep ecological knowledge. Generations observed animal migrations, plant cycles, river freeze patterns. You think about how modern life often disconnects people from such rhythms. Here those rhythms are survival. You brush snow from your sleeve and watch it scatter in fine crystals. You imagine the communal effort required to relocate. Elders advising on timing, hunters scouting routes, women packing preserved food and essential tools, children learning by watching, absorbing patterns that will one day guide their own decisions. A curious anecdote appears in early accounts from explorers who sometimes misunderstood seasonal movement as aimless roaming. In reality, these migrations were highly structured and purposeful. What looked chaotic to an outsider often reflected sophisticated planning attuned to environment rather than rigid borders. You return toward the warmth of the dwelling and consider how movement itself generates heat. Walking through snow hauling supplies, tending animals. Physical labor becomes another source of internal warmth. Remaining still for too long in deep cold invites danger. Activity keeps blood circulating, fingers, flexible breath steady. There is ongoing academic reflection about how contact with European settlers and the imposition of fixed boundaries disrupted traditional seasonal rounds, complicating winter survival strategies. The shift from mobility to confinement altered access to resources in profound ways. You sense the weight of that transformation, though. Here, in this earlier moment, movement remains free and responsive. You step back inside and feel the familiar wave of gentler air. The fire has been revived, flames licking upward once more. People begin to prepare for the day, some heading out to check traps, others tending to stored supplies. You realize now that winter survival is not solely about enduring cold in one place. It is about knowing when to stay and when to move, when to shelter deeply within thick walls and when to follow the land's subtle invitations elsewhere. Outside, the snow continues to reshape the landscape. Inside, plans are already forming routes, remembered decisions made with quiet confidence. And as you warm your hands once more by the fire, you understand that heating is not confined to walls or garments. It is embedded in motion, in foresight, in the willingness to follow the seasons rather than resist them. The day unfolds slowly, pale light, stretching thin across the snow before fading again toward afternoon. You remain inside for a while, watching as bundles are brought down from rafters and storage pits are carefully opened. Winter may seem like a season of stillness, but beneath that stillness lies careful management. Nothing is taken for granted. Every strip of dried meat, every pouch of grain, every cluster of berries has a purpose. You kneel beside a storage container lined with hide and woven fibre. When it is opened, the scent that rises is earthy and faintly sweet. Dried corn kernels glint softly in the firelight. They are small, unassuming, yet packed with energy gathered from long summer days. You imagine fields under a blazing sun months ago, hands moving quickly at harvest time, laughter echoing across rows. Those warm memories are folded into this quiet winter moment. It is a well-established historical reality that many Native American communities relied heavily on preserved foods to survive freezing months. Techniques such as drying, smoking, fermenting, and caching allowed surplus from abundant seasons to carry families through scarcity. You pick up a strip of dried fish and feel how light it is compared to its original form. Water removed, flavour concentrated, shelf life extended. Outside, snow continues to thicken, muffling the world further. Inside, the fire crackles as someone adds another piece of wood. You sit close enough to feel its warmth on one cheek, while your other cheek still senses the chill drifting in from the entrance. The balance is delicate. There is thoughtful, scholarly conversation about how storage methods varied across regions depending on climate and available materials. In colder northern areas, frozen ground itself could serve as a natural freezer. In more temperate zones, underground pits lined with bark or grass created cool, stable environments. Archaeological excavations have uncovered such pits, revealing remnants of stored maize and other crops that speak quietly of preparation. Steam carries a faint tang that brightens the smoky air. You're reminded that winter meals are not solely about survival. They're about maintaining health and spirit. A small but intriguing detail from historical accounts drifts through your thoughts. In some regions, communities constructed elevated storage platforms to protect food from animals and moisture. Raised above the ground, these structures allowed air to circulate while keeping precious supplies safe. You picture wooden posts supporting a small shelter filled with carefully wrapped bundles, each one a safeguard against hunger. You reach for a piece of dried meat and chew slowly. It is tough at first, then softens with warmth and saliva. The flavour is rich, concentrated. You feel energy return to your limbs almost immediately. Food here is direct, honest. There is no excess packaging, no expiration date printed in ink, only memory and vigilance. Researchers continue to explore how communities calculated the amount of food required to last an entire winter. Estimates would have depended on family size, expected weather severity, and success in supplementary hunting. Some evidence suggests communal sharing systems helped balance shortages, ensuring that no household faced starvation alone. You imagine quiet negotiations, generous exchanges, subtle acts of mutual support. You glance toward the doorway where snow has formed a partial barrier. Even that drift plays a role in protecting stored supplies by stabilizing temperatures around the dwelling. Snow outside preserved food inside. Layers of protection interlocking. Another broadly recognized point comes gently into focus. Preservation was not limited to meat and grain. Roots and tubers were sometimes stored in cool, dark places to remain edible for months. You imagine digging into the earth before the first hard freeze, lining a pit with insulating material, carefully layering vegetables inside, covering them securely. It is patience transformed into security. The fire's warmth deepens as more wood is added, and someone stirs the pot where berries and meat mingle. The scent grows complex, savoury, and slightly sweet. You feel your stomach respond again, though you ate not long ago. In winter, hunger returns quickly. The body demands steady fuel. There remains academic reflection on how changing environmental conditions affected food storage over centuries. Periods of colder climate may have shortened growing seasons, requiring even more careful planning. Archaeological layers sometimes reveal shifts in diet composition that hint at adaptation. You imagine researchers analysing plant remains under microscopes, reconstructing winter menus from charred fragments. You notice how food preparation itself generates warmth. Steam rises as your hands move briskly, bodies shift and bend. Activity keeps blood flowing and the dwelling hums quietly with purpose. A charming observation recorded by early visitors noted the generosity shown during winter gatherings when families shared preserved delicacies as a sign of hospitality. Even in the leanest season, there was room for ceremony and kindness. You picture a special portion set aside for a guest offered, with quiet pride. You sit back chewing thoughtfully and consider how different winter would feel without these carefully stored reserves. Fire alone cannot sustain life. Clothing alone cannot fill an empty stomach. Food is the slow flame that burns from within, steady and essential. Outside, the landscape remains frozen and vast. Inside, shelves and containers hold the memory of warmer days. Summer has not vanished. It has been transformed and stored, waiting patiently for moments like this. You draw your robe tighter around you and feel gratitude for hands that harvested, dried and packed long before you arrived. Winter survival is not improvisation. It is foresight made tangible. And as you watch another handful of berries disappear into the simmering pot, you understand that heating without metal stoves or radiators is also about nourishment. It is about carrying sunlight in dried kernels and smoked flesh, releasing it slowly in the heart of winter. The fire burns a little brighter now, fed by both wood and the quiet rhythm of the day. You sit cross-legged near the wall, watching as someone lifts a heavy robe and shakes it gently before draping it back over a sleeping platform. The fur catches the light in soft ripples. You reach out and let your fingers sink into its thickness. It feels almost alive with warmth. You begin to notice that not all furs in the dwelling are the same. Some are dense and plush, others sleeker and lighter. Each has a purpose. In this world, animal skins are not interchangeable. They are chosen with remarkable precision. It's widely acknowledged that certain furs perform exceptionally well in extreme cold because of the structure of their hair. Caribou hair, for example, is hollow, trapping air inside each strand and creating excellent insulation. You imagine wrapping yourself in a caribou parka, feeling the way the trapped air holds warmth close to your body even as the outside temperature plummets. You shift your attention to another robe, perhaps made from beaver or buffalo. Beaver fur with its dense undercoat resists moisture and retains heat even when damp. Buffalo hides, especially when worn with the fur side inward, provide substantial insulation against wind. You begin to understand that winter clothing and bedding here are not random collections of hides. They are carefully curated tools. There remains thoughtful academic exploration into how different communities prioritize certain animals based on regional climate. In the far north, caribou and seal were essential. On the plains, buffalo dominated. In forested regions, deer and smaller mammals provided adaptable materials. Archaeological findings of hide processing tools suggest that this knowledge was systematic, passed down and refined across generations. You watch as someone carefully folds a fur garment, placing it near the fire, but not too close. Heat can damage hide if applied carelessly. Maintenance is as important as acquisition. You imagine the many hours required to prepare a single garment, scraping away fat and tissue, softening the hide until it bends easily, sewing pieces together with sinew thread, each stitch pulled tight by hand. A small but fascinating detail emerges in your thoughts. In some northern communities, winter boots were constructed with different types of fur oriented in specific directions to improve insulation and moisture management. The outer layer might repel snow while the inner lining trapped warmth. It is a subtle form of material science practiced without laboratories. You lift one edge of a hide and press your cheek briefly against it. The sensation is surprisingly gentle. The fur warms quickly under contact, holding heat rather than stealing it. You think of your modern wool blanket and realize how similar the principle is, though here it comes directly from the land. Another well-documented reality surfaces. Clothing was often tailored to fit snugly without restricting movement. Loose garments allow cold air to circulate too freely. Overly tight garments compress insulating layers and reduce effectiveness. The balance is delicate. You picture skilled hands adjusting seams, ensuring a hood frames the face closely enough to block wind while still allowing clear vision. There is ongoing discussion among historians about how trade networks influenced access to specific furs. Some regions lacked certain animals, yet acquired their pelts through exchange with neighbouring groups. This meant that winter survival sometimes depended not only on local hunting, but on inter-community relationships. You imagine bundles of hides travelling long distances carried across rivers and plains before snow sealed the routes. You notice that children's garments appear particularly well insulated. Smaller bodies lose heat more quickly. Extra layers fur-lined hoods, mittens designed to keep tiny fingers together. Protection is attentive and deliberate. A curious anecdote from early observers describes how some indigenous hunters could judge the quality of a fur by touch alone, running their fingers against the grain and assessing density instantly. That tactile knowledge feels almost mystical to you now, though it was simply experience honed through necessity. You lean back and observe the arrangement of hides along the wall. They serve not only as clothing and bedding, but also as insulation lining the structure itself. Fur against skin, fur against earth, fur against wood, layers upon layers of warmth. It is firmly recognized that the processing of hides required specialized knowledge often held and transmitted within families. Techniques for tanning, softening, and waterproofing were cultural treasures. You imagine winter evenings spent sewing by firelight, stories shared as hands moved steadily through thick material. There is also scholarly curiosity about how climate fluctuations over centuries influenced the types of animals hunted, primarily for fur versus meat. Shifts in population or migration patterns may have subtly altered the balance of materials available. Archaeologists studying preserved textiles and tools attempt to trace these changes, piecing together stories from fragments. You draw a fur robe around your shoulders once more, and feel the difference it makes even within the insulated dwelling. The heat from your body stays close, building slowly rather than dissipating into the air. It is not dramatic warmth. It is sustained warmth. Outside, the wind lifts briefly, sending a faint shiver through the entrance flap. You hear it, but do not feel its full force. The combination of architecture, fire food, and now carefully selected animal skins creates a layered defense. You realize that heating without modern devices relies on understanding materials at an intimate level, knowing which fur traps air best, which hide resists moisture, which seam holds firm under strain. These are not trivial details, they are life-preserving distinctions. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine walking across a frozen landscape wrapped in these garments. The air would still sting your face, your breath would still fog, but beneath the outer chill, a quiet warmth would travel with you stitched into every layer. And as you sit, surrounded by hides that once roamed forests and tundra, you begin to appreciate the profound relationship between people and animals in winter survival. Heating here is not a switch on a wall. It is the careful transformation of living creatures into enduring protection against the freeze. The fire has settled into a calm, steady glow, and the day moves with quiet purpose. You notice a small figure near the entrance, bundled in layers that seem almost too large for such a slight frame. A child stands there watching the snow drift past the opening, eyes bright with curiosity rather than fear. Winter is not new to them. It is a teacher they have known since their earliest breath. You sit back and observe how even the youngest members of the community move confidently within this frozen world. There is no frantic rushing to shield them from every gust. Instead, there is careful preparation and gradual learning. A firmly grounded historical understanding is that children in many Native American societies were introduced early to practical skills suited to their environment, including those essential for winter survival. Knowledge was not postponed until adulthood. It was woven into daily life. You watch as an elder kneels beside the child and adjusts the fur lining around their hood, tucking it closer to protect cheeks from froidil. The gesture is gentle, practiced. The child listens as something is explained softly, perhaps about how to recognize thin ice or how to judge the direction of wind by watching drifting snow. These lessons are not dramatic lectures, they are small repeated observations shared over years. Scoops up a handful of snow, packing it, scoops up a handful of snow, packing it firmly, testing its texture. It is almost playful, yet you sense it is also instructional. Knowing how snow behaves can mean knowing how to build, how to travel, how to avoid danger. There is ongoing scholarly reflection about how childhood in Indigenous communities differed from later European models that emphasize rigid schooling. Many accounts suggest that learning occurred through observation and participation. In winter, this meant children witnessing the preparation of food, the maintenance of fires, the careful storage of supplies. You imagine how deeply such lessons would settle when tied directly to comfort and survival. A small but striking detail recorded in some ethnographic notes mentions that children were sometimes given miniature tools to practice essential skills. Small bows, tiny snowshoes, child-sized scraping implements. You picture a young child stepping into shortened snowshoes, wobbling slightly at first, then gaining balance with encouragement. Each step across the snow becomes a rehearsal for adulthood. You pause and watch as the child crouches near a drift and examines the surface. Perhaps they are looking for animal tracks, faint impressions that reveal movement beneath the quiet white. Tracking in winter is often easier than in summer prints preserved clearly against snow. Even children learn to notice patterns early. A line of small marks might mean rabbit. A larger indentation could signal deer. Knowledge begins with curiosity. Another widely accepted reality is that winter games sometimes doubled as skill-building exercises, sliding across ice, running through snow, practicing balance and endurance. Physical play strengthens muscles and increases tolerance to cold. You smile faintly at the thought that what appears to be simple fun is also preparation. You feel the wind shift slightly, and watch as the child turns instinctively hood, framing their face against the gust. The layers they wear are carefully secured mittens tied to sleeves so they are not lost in drifts. Every detail reflects foresight. There is thoughtful debate among historians regarding how much exposure to cold children experienced compared to adults. Some suggest gradual acclimatization from infancy increased tolerance, while others caution that protection was always prioritized. The truth likely lies in balance, exposure enough to build resilience, protection enough to prevent harm. You step closer and notice how the child's cheeks are flushed but not pale. Movement keeps warmth circulating. They stamp their boots, lightly testing the packed path. You remember how snowshoes distribute weight and imagine the pride of mastering such tools at a young age. A charming anecdote appears in early descriptions from explorers who were surprised at how comfortably indigenous children seemed to move in winter conditions that left European newcomers struggling. What appeared extraordinary was simply familiarity shaped by lifelong adaptation. You return toward the dwelling, the child trotting ahead confidently. Inside, the warmth feels welcoming but not shocking. The child removes outer layers, methodically shaking off snow before stepping fully into the interior space. That small habit prevents moisture from seeping inward. Lessons absorbed quietly. You watch as the child settles near the fire, hands extended toward the glow, eyes reflecting the flicker. There is no sense of fear in their posture. Winter is not portrayed as an enemy to be conquered. It is a condition to be understood. Researchers continue to examine how early skill transmission contributed to long-term survival in harsh climates. Communities where knowledge flowed freely across generations were better equipped to endure unpredictable seasons. You imagine the chain of instruction stretching back centuries each winter, adding another layer of understanding. You sit down once more and feel the calm rhythm of the space. Children here do not wait for adulthood to begin learning about warmth, shelter, and food. They grow into these skills gradually guided by example rather than abstract instruction. Outside, snow drifts steadily. Inside, a child listens to an elder's quiet voice, absorbing details that may one day protect their own family. And as you watch that small figure leaning toward the fire, you realize that heating without modern systems depends not only on materials and architecture, but on memory, on teaching, on ensuring that even the youngest know how to tend a flame, judge a storm, and wrap themselves in warmth. Winter stretches long, but knowledge stretches longer. By late afternoon, the sky lowers into a pale silver haze, and the wind begins to gather strength again. You step outside and feel it immediately, a sharper edge sliding across the open ground. Yet when you turn back toward the village, you notice something subtle. The gusts do not strike the dwellings directly. They seem to curve, to split, to lose force before reaching the entrances. You walk slowly along the outer edge of the settlement and begin to see the pattern. The homes are not scattered randomly. They form a kind of quiet arrangement positioned with awareness of prevailing winds and the lay of the land. A broadly recognized historical reality is that many Native American settlements were intentionally oriented to reduce exposure to harsh winter winds using both natural features and structural placement as protection. You stand at the edge of the clearing and feel how the tree line behind the homes acts like a shield, breaking the strongest gusts before they reach the walls. You move to a slightly higher rise and look down at the layout. The dwellings cluster close enough to create a barrier effect, each one helping to block wind for the others. Openings tend to face away from the direction of the most punishing winter blasts. It is not dramatic engineering, it is careful attention to landscape. There has been thoughtful academic discussion about how consistently such planning was applied across different regions. In some areas, archaeological evidence shows repeated settlement patterns aligned with wind direction. In others, terrain dictated placement more strongly than climate. You imagine researchers mapping ancient post holes and hearth locations, overlaying wind data to understand decisions made centuries ago. You walk toward a natural embankment behind the village. The slope rises gently, forming a partial wall against the north. In winter, that rise becomes more than scenery. It becomes insulation against moving air. Cold wind accelerates across open plains but slows when forced to climb over obstacles. You feel the difference immediately when you stand in its shadow. The air is calmer, the bite less severe. A small yet intriguing detail appears in early descriptions from various regions. Some communities planted or preserved stands of trees deliberately around settlements, recognizing their value as windbreaks. The trees were not only sources of fuel and material, they were living barriers. You imagine a ring of evergreens standing firm through snow branches, heavy but protective. You circle back toward the dwellings and notice how entrances are often slightly recessed or shielded by short partitions. These small architectural adjustments reduce the rush of cold air when doors are opened. You picture someone stepping inside quickly, the draft minimized by design rather than luck. Another firmly established point is that some winter villages were located near bodies of water that froze over, creating access to fishing, while also benefiting from slightly moderated temperatures. Large bodies of water can influence local climate, sometimes softening extremes. You stand at the edge of a frozen river and feel how the air here seems subtly different from the open clearing beyond. There remains ongoing scholarly inquiry into how climate fluctuations over centuries may have influenced settlement placement. During colder intervals, did communities shift to more sheltered valleys? Did heavier snowfall encourage clustering for mutual protection? Archaeological layers sometimes hint at relocation patterns tied to changing environmental pressures, though interpretation requires caution. You crouch beside a dwelling and examine how the exterior meets the ground. Snow has been packed deliberately along the base, sealing small gaps where wind might otherwise slip through. The effect is simple but effective. You run your gloved hand along the packed snow and feel how solid it has become. A curious anecdote surfaces from early travellers who observed circular village arrangements among certain plains groups. While often described for social or ceremonial reasons, such circular layouts may also have reduced wind exposure by avoiding sharp corners that catch gusts. You imagine wind moving around a circle more smoothly than around a square. You step back and listen. The wind hums at the edge of the settlement but grows quieter near the centre. Sound itself changes with shelter. It feels as though you have entered a pocket carved from the larger storm. Inside one of the dwellings, the fire flickers gently, its flame steady despite the strengthening gusts outside. You realize that architecture does not end at walls and roofs. It extends to how buildings relate to one another and to the land itself. Researchers continued to explore how Indigenous planning principles reflected deep environmental awareness rather than abstract geometry. Settlements were not imposed upon the landscape. They were integrated into it. Orientation, spacing, proximity to trees and water. Each decision layered protection upon protection. You stand once more at the edge of the village and face the wind directly. It pushes against your chest, sharp and insistent. Then you turn and step back into the sheltered cluster of homes. The difference is immediate. The air softens. The force dissipates. You think about your own modern neighbourhood, where houses often face streets without regard for prevailing winds, relying instead on mechanical heating to compensate. Here, heating begins long before a fire is lit. It begins with placement. As the sky darkens further and snow starts to fall in fine slanting lines, you feel a quiet admiration for this thoughtful design. The village is not only a collection of shelters, it is a coordinated defence against cold. And as you slip back inside to the steady glow of the hearth, you understand that surviving winter without modern heating depends on more than insulation and food. It depends on choosing where to stand, where to build, and how to let the land itself share in the work of keeping warmth alive. The next morning dawns pale and brittle, the sky stretched thin over a landscape locked in frost. You wake before the fire is fully revived, feeling the coolness that settles in the hours just before sunrise. It is the coldest part of the day. Your breath lingers faintly in the air as you sit up and draw your robe closer. There is no lingering in bed for long. Winter demands movement. You step outside with a small group preparing to head toward the frozen river. Snowshoes are fastened with practiced efficiency, rawhide bindings pulled snug. A spear and a bundle of tools are lifted from near the doorway. The cold stings your cheeks immediately, but within a few steps your blood begins to warm. It's widely recognized as historical reality that winter hunting and fishing were essential components of survival across many Indigenous communities. While stored food carried families through much of the season, fresh meat and fish remained critical supplements. Frozen rivers and lakes once barriers transformed into highways and larders. You walk across the hard-packed path leading to the river's edge. The snow squeaks beneath your snowshoes, each step steady and measured. When you reach the frozen surface, you feel a brief flicker of hesitation. Ice stretches wide and white, marked only by subtle ridges where currents once flowed. Yet the others move confidently, scanning the surface with attentive eyes. You watch as someone kneels and clears away snow from a familiar spot. Beneath it, the ice is thick and opaque. A tool strikes the surface, rhythmically chipping through layer by layer until dark water appears below. Steam rises faintly where the frigid air meets the exposed water. There has been careful scholarly examination of how ice fishing techniques varied by region. In the north, Inuit communities developed specialized harpoons and hooks designed for catching fish beneath sea ice, sometimes using carved bone or ivory points. Farther south, different tools were adapted for freshwater species. Archaeological discoveries of fishing implements confirm that winter harvests were far from improvised. You crouch near the opening and peer into the dark water. It feels improbable that life moves beneath such stillness, yet you know it does. A line is lowered carefully. The group waits in near silence, the only sounds the wind brushing across the ice and the faint drip of water freezing at the edge of the hole. A small yet captivating detail from historical accounts mentions that some Arctic hunters used subtle vibrations on the ice to attract curious seals near breathing holes. The technique required patience and acute observation. You imagine standing for hours in the cold, listening for the faintest sign of movement below. You feel the air grow sharper as clouds pass overhead. The sun, weak and distant, offers little warmth. But you notice that standing here, engaged in activity, you are not as cold as you were lying still before dawn. Movement fuels heat. Muscles generate warmth from within. Another well-established point is that winter hunting often relied on tracking animals whose movements became more visible against snow. You glance toward the tree line and notice a faint line of impressions cutting across the clearing. Perhaps rabbit, perhaps fox. Snow turns the land into a record of motion, revealing what summer grasses conceal. There remains thoughtful academic debate regarding how much winter hunting contributed to overall diet compared to stored provisions. In some regions it was supplementary. In others, particularly in the far north where agriculture was limited, it remained central. The balance shifted with geography and season. A sudden tug on the line pulls your attention back to the fishing hole. With practiced care, the line is drawn upward, revealing a glistening fish scales flashing briefly in the pale light. It is quickly secured and set aside, steam rising from its body in the cold air. You feel a small thrill of relief. Fresh food means sustained strength. You stand and stamp your feet lightly to keep circulation steady. Snowshoes prevent you from sinking, distributing your weight evenly across the surface. Without them, each step would plunge you knee-deep, exhausting and dangerous. The design is simple yet transformative. Researchers continue to explore how winter hunting tools evolved over centuries, adapting to changes in animal populations and climate. Some evidence suggests refinements in spear points and trap mechanisms that improved efficiency. Each adjustment reflects observation and experimentation carried forward across generations. You glance toward the forest again and imagine a small hunting party moving quietly among trees, boughs, drawn, breath controlled. Winter air carries sound differently. Every snap of a twig echoes farther. Success depends on awareness sharpened by cold. A curious anecdote appears in some early writings describing how certain groups wore white or pale outer garments during winter hunts to blend with snow-covered landscapes, camouflage long before the word existed. You picture figures moving almost invisibly against drifts, merging with the environment rather than standing apart from it. As the group gathers tools and prepares to return, you feel the steady warmth generated by effort. Your fingers are cold, but not numb. Your cheeks flushed, but not raw. Activity, clothing knowledge and planning intertwine seamlessly. You walk back toward the village, carrying the fish carefully. Smoke rises faintly from the dwelling roofs, signaling warmth within. The contrast between open ice and sheltered interior feels profound. Winter here is not a time of passive waiting. It is active dynamic, requiring constant engagement with the land. Hunting and fishing continue despite freezing temperatures, not in defiance of them, but in cooperation with seasonal shifts. And as you step inside once more, setting the fresh catch near the hearth, you understand that heating without modern systems depends on more than walls and fire. It depends on stepping out into the cold when necessary, gathering sustenance from beneath ice and among snow, and returning with the means to keep both body and flame alive. Night settles early again, as it does in the deep stretch of winter. The last pale light drains from the sky, leaving a vast blue darkness pressed gently against the village. You sit near the fire, the fresh fish now cleaned and simmering softly in a pot, its scent mingling with smoke, and the faint sweetness of dried berries added for flavour. The work of the day slows. Tools are set aside, snowshoes lean against the wall. The fire is stirred carefully, flames coaxed into a steady glow rather than a fierce blaze. Outside, the cold deepens, but inside something else begins to rise. Voices. You notice how the atmosphere shifts once physical tasks are done. Someone begins to speak low and measured. Others lean in slightly, faces lit by flickering light. The room feels warmer, though the temperature has not changed dramatically. You realize that warmth is not only physical, it is emotional, spiritual, communal. It's broadly recognized that storytelling ceremony and shared ritual played a significant role during winter months in many Native American cultures. Winter, with its long nights and reduced travel, became a season for oral tradition. Histories were recited, myths were retold, lessons were embedded in narrative. You settle into your robe and let the rhythm of a voice carry you. The story being told is not shouted. It unfolds slowly with pauses that allow the fire to crackle and the wind to sigh outside. You catch glimpses of animals that speak of ancestors who faced storms greater than this, one of clever heroes who survived through wit and patience. The imagery seems to expand the small dwelling into a vast landscape of memory. There has been careful scholarly reflection on why many communities reserved certain stories specifically for winter. In some traditions, sacred narratives were told only when snow covered the ground. The quiet season provided both the time and the appropriate setting. You imagine the intimacy of these moments when knowledge passed from elder to child in the glow of embers. You watch the faces around you. Children listen wide-eyed, absorbing not just entertainment but instruction. Adults nod subtly at familiar passages. The firelight casts shadows that dance along the walls, making figures seem almost alive within the flicker. A small but fascinating detail appears in ethnographic notes from various regions. Some winter ceremonies involved the use of masks or costumes crafted carefully and stored until the proper season. These performances were not merely dramatic displays, they reinforced community bonds and spiritual balance during the harshest months. You picture a carved wooden mask emerging from its wrappings, its painted surface catching firelight as it is lifted reverently. Outside, the wind picks up, brushing against the dwelling with a soft but insistent tone. Inside, the storyteller continues without interruption. The contrast feels powerful. The world beyond the walls may be frozen and dark, but within this circle warmth grows. Another widely accepted reality is that communal gatherings during winter helped reduce feelings of isolation that could accompany prolonged cold and darkness. Shared meals, songs, and stories strengthened social ties. You feel it yourself as the voice weaves through the room. The cold seems less threatening when surrounded by others. There remains thoughtful academic discussion about how spiritual beliefs intersected with environmental knowledge. Stories often carried practical lessons disguised as myth. A tale about a trickster ignoring warnings might subtly teach children to respect weather signs. The line between entertainment and instruction blurs gently. You lean closer to the fire and feel its heat brush your face. Sparks rise and vanish into the smoke vent above. The storyteller pauses, and for a moment there is only the sound of breathing and the low hum of wind. A curious anecdote recorded by early visitors describes how some winter gatherings could last for hours with multiple speakers taking turns through the night. The endurance required for such sessions reflects the long darkness outside. When daylight is scarce, night becomes a canvas for memory. You glance toward the doorway, now sealed tightly against drafts. Snow presses softly against the exterior walls. The dwelling feels like a cocoon suspended in a vast white expanse. Researchers continue to explore how winter rituals reinforced resilience in the face of environmental stress. Psychological warmth can be as vital as physical insulation. Communities that maintained strong cultural practices often demonstrated remarkable endurance through harsh seasons. You listen as the story reaches a turning point, the hero facing a blizzard much like the one whispering outside now. The parallel is unmistakable. Through narrative, winter becomes something comprehensible, even familiar. It is no longer an unnamed threat. It is part of a larger cycle. Someone begins to hum softly after the story ends, a low, steady melody that seems to echo the rhythm of wind. Others join voices blending gently. The sound fills the dwelling warmer than the fire alone could ever be. You feel your shoulders relax further, tension melting into the shared cadence. The room is small, yet it contains generations of memory. Outside, snow falls in patient silence. Inside, voices rise and fall like a tide. And as you sit there, wrapped in fur and surrounded by song, you understand that surviving freezing winters without modern heating depends not only on physical ingenuity, but on sustaining the spirit. Fire warms the body. Stories warm the mind. The night stretches long beyond the walls, But within this circle of light and voice, winter feels less like an adversary and more like a chapter in a story you now share. The night stories linger in your thoughts long after the final embers dim and sleep takes hold. When morning comes, it carries a thin, pearled light that makes the snow shimmer faintly. You rise slowly, aware that winter here does not look the same everywhere across the vast continent. What you are witnessing in this village is only one expression of adaptation. You step outside and imagine yourself travelling south, west, east, and far north, tracing the immense diversity of landscapes where Native American communities endured freezing seasons. The air feels sharp in your lungs, but your mind drifts across tundra plains, forests, and coastal shores. It's a well-documented historical truth that indigenous peoples across North America developed region-specific winter strategies shaped by climate and terrain. In the Arctic, Inuit communities crafted snow houses and relied heavily on marine hunting. On the Great Plains, tribes such as the Lakota or Blackfoot constructed portable tipis insulated with buffalo hides, adjusting their camps to follow herds even during cold months. In the eastern woodlands, Iroquoian longhouses sheltered multiple families under bark-covered frames, central fires warming extended kin groups. You pause and imagine the Arctic first. Their daylight nearly vanishes for weeks. Temperatures plunge to extremes difficult to comprehend. Snow houses, carefully constructed in spirals, trap heat astonishingly well. Oil lamps, fueled by seal fat, glow steadily within white domes. Survival depends on mastery of sea ice breathing holes and seasonal animal patterns. The cold is relentless, yet adaptation is precise. Then your thoughts shift to the plains. Winter winds sweep unbroken across open grasslands, driving snow into drifts that can swallow the horizon. Portable tipis, though often associated with summer mobility, could be adapted for winter, with extra linings and snow banking around the base. Buffalo provided not only food but heavy robes and hides thick enough to shield against biting gusts. You feel the imagined weight of a buffalo robe around your shoulders, heavy but reassuring. There remains ongoing scholarly discussion about how rapidly plains communities adapted to the introduction of horses and how this influenced winter mobility. Before, widespread horse use movement followed different rhythms. With horses, distances expanded, altering patterns of seasonal travel and access to resources. The interplay between technology and climate adds another layer to winter survival. You turn your thoughts eastward toward the forests. There, trees break the wind and offer abundant wood for fuel. Longhouses stretch lengthwise, multiple hearths glowing along the central corridor. Thick bark walls and interior partitions hold warmth surprisingly well. Snow piles outside, but within communal life hums steadily. A curious historical detail appears in accounts of some southeastern tribes who experienced milder winters compared to northern regions. While freezing temperatures were less prolonged, occasional cold snaps still demanded preparation. Structures were built to balance ventilation for humid summers with insulation for winter chills. The challenge there was flexibility rather than sheer endurance. You reflect on the southwest, where desert winters can bring sharp nighttime cold despite warm days. Pueblo communities constructed multi-story adobe dwellings with thick earthen walls that absorbed heat during daylight and released it slowly after sunset. Though not facing Arctic extremes, they still relied on architectural intelligence to moderate temperature swings. It's broadly recognized that regional differences shape not only housing, but clothing, diet, and seasonal routines. Caribou and seal in the north, buffalo on the plains, deer and small game in forests, fish along coasts, each environment offered distinct materials for warmth. You feel the growing sense of admiration for the adaptability embedded across these cultures. Winter was not a singular experience but a spectrum. Strategies varied, yet the core principle remained consistent. Observe the land closely. Respond with care. There has been thoughtful academic exploration into how intertribal trade allowed certain winter technologies or materials to spread beyond their original regions. Coastal shells might travel inland. Furs from colder climates might be exchanged with neighbouring groups. Such networks subtly influence survival methods, weaving connections across vast distances. You glance at the snow under your boots and imagine how differently it might fall in each region. Fine and dry in the Arctic, heavy and wet in forested zones, sparse but icy in desert elevations. The texture of snow itself alters building techniques and daily tasks. A small yet striking anecdote recorded by early observers described how newcomers from Europe often underestimated the sophistication of indigenous winter dwellings simply because they lacked chimneys or metal stoves. Over time, some realized that comfort inside these structures could rival or surpass their own poorly insulated cabins. Appearances misled those who did not understand the principles at work. You step back toward the warmth of the dwelling and consider how the concept of heating shifts across regions. In one place it is an oil lamp in a snow dome, in another a line of hearths in a bark-covered hall, elsewhere a carefully banked fire within a hide-wrapped tipi. Researchers continue to analyse archaeological remains and historical accounts to better understand regional nuances in winter adaptation. Each discovery adds texture to a broader picture of resilience. You sit once more near the hearth, aware now that the strategies you have witnessed are part of a larger tapestry. From tundra to forest to prairie communities develop solutions attuned to their surroundings, rather than imposing uniform designs. Outside the snow lies quiet and reflective, inside warmth gathers steadily. And as you let your gaze drift into the firelight, you understand that surviving freezing winters without modern heating was never a single story. It was many stories shaped by geography, culture, and ingenuity, each one proving that adaptation thrives wherever knowledge meets environment. The afternoon light fades early again, and you begin to notice something subtler than wind or hunger. It is dampness, a faint chill that creeps not from open air but from moisture itself. You brush snow from your sleeve as you step inside, careful to shake it free before it melts. The difference between dry cold and wet cold becomes suddenly unmistakably clear. You kneel near the entrance and remove your outer layer, hanging it where warmth from the hearth can dry any lingering dampness. It is not simply a matter of comfort. Moisture steals heat with quiet efficiency. Even in freezing temperatures, melting snow against skin can draw warmth away faster than the air itself. It is a well-established historical understanding that dryness was critical to winter survival in cold climates. Indigenous communities across North America developed habits and techniques to keep clothing, bedding, and shelter interiors as dry as possible. You run your fingers along a fur robe near the fire and feel its surface. Soft, warm, not clammy. You glance toward the smoke vent above. Ventilation matters here. Too little airflow and condensation builds inside dampening walls and garments. Too much airflow and precious heat escapes. Balancing these forces requires constant attention. The fire crackles softly, its smoke drifting upward in a controlled stream. There has been considerable scholarly interest in how ventilation systems were managed in winter dwellings. Some researchers suggest that adjustable flaps or covers allowed inhabitants to fine-tune smoke escape while minimizing drafts. Others point to structural design such as angled entrances and interior partitions that reduced airflow turbulence. The debate continues, but the practical knowledge is evident in the steady dryness around you. You sit near the hearth and extend your boots toward the warmth, not too close, just enough to release hidden moisture. Steam rises faintly, nearly invisible against the firelight. The scent of damp leather mingles with smoke. A small yet fascinating detail appears in various ethnographic records. In certain northern communities, people regularly turned their garments inside out to dry the inner lining closest to the skin. That simple habit prevented moisture buildup that could otherwise freeze overnight. You imagine the quiet ritual of reversing layers before sleep, ensuring that morning would not greet you with icy fabric. You look toward the bedding area. Furs are lifted and shaken periodically, allowing trapped moisture to dissipate. Even snow used as insulation must remain dry and loosely packed. If it melts and refreezes unevenly, it loses effectiveness. Another widely recognized reality is that wet conditions in cold climates can be more dangerous than extreme dry cold. Frostbite risk increases when skin is damp. Hypothermia can set in faster when clothing loses insulating properties. You feel a deeper appreciation for the vigilance required here. There remains thoughtful academic discussion about how different regions handled winter moisture challenges. Coastal areas with higher humidity demanded distinct strategies compared to arid northern interiors. In forested zones, melting snow dripping from branches could soak garments unexpectedly. Adaptation varied with environment, yet the principle remained constant: stay dry to stay warm. You watch as someone near the doorway gently scrapes packed snow from the base of the entrance, ensuring it does not melt inward during warmer hours. It's a small act easily overlooked, yet essential. A curious anecdote from early travellers describes how some newcomers struggled in winter, not because temperatures were colder than expected, but because they underestimated the impact of damp clothing. Indigenous guides often emphasized drying gear thoroughly, each evening, a practice that sometimes puzzled outsiders accustomed to different climates. You press your palm against the interior wall and feel that it's cool but not wet. Materials have been chosen carefully to resist condensation. Earth walls absorb some moisture but also regulate it. Snowbanks outside remain frozen rather than slushy. Researchers continue to examine preserved textiles and dwellings to better understand moisture management techniques. Subtle design elements once dismissed as incidental now appear deliberate under closer study. You pull your robe tighter around your shoulders and notice how comfortable it feels once fully dry. The difference between slightly damp and fully dry is profound. One chills slowly, the other comforts steadily. Outside, the wind shifts again, carrying a fine mist of snow that clings briefly before falling away. You imagine how easily that fine layer could melt against warm skin and then refreeze if left unchecked. You step toward the entrance and watch as someone resecures the flap, carefully minimizing gaps where humid breath might escape and condense along colder surfaces. Even breathing contributes moisture to the interior air. Managing that balance is ongoing. Another firmly grounded point emerges in your thoughts. Many communities used raised platforms for sleeping not only to avoid ground chill, but also to reduce exposure to dampness rising from earth. Elevation improves air circulation beneath bedding. You sit again near the fire, feeling the steady warmth and the reassuring dryness of your garments. The room feels balanced, neither stifling nor drafty, and as you listen to the quiet crackle of embers, you understand that winter survival without modern heating is as much about controlling water as it is about generating heat. Cold alone can be endured. Damp cold seeps deeper. You draw a slow breath, sensing the dry warmth against your skin, and realize that vigilance over moisture is another invisible thread woven into this intricate tapestry of resilience. Morning arrives with a thin wash of light, and you step outside to find the snow newly settled smooth as untouched linen. The air feels sharp, but your body has grown accustomed to its clarity. Today, attention turns not to walls or food, but to tools. Winter demands equipment shaped precisely for its challenges. You kneel beside a pair of snowshoes resting near the entrance. Their frames curve gently, wood bent into elongated ovals. Rawhide lacing forms an intricate web across each surface. You lift one carefully and feel how light it is despite its size. The design spreads weight across a broader area, allowing you to walk over deep snow without sinking. It's well documented that snowshoes were developed in various forms across northern regions of North America, each tailored to local terrain. Some were long and narrow for open landscapes. Others were shorter and wider for forested areas where maneuverability mattered more than stride length. You slip your boot into the binding and stand cautiously. The difference is immediate. The snow supports you rather than swallowing you. You take a few steps and feel an unexpected grace in the movement. The lacing flexes slightly under your weight, then springs back. This is not crude equipment. It is refined through generations of trial and observation. There has been sustained scholarly interest in how snowshoe designs evolved regionally. Archaeological evidence and preserved examples reveal subtle variations that correspond closely to environmental conditions. Some historians suggest that trade networks allowed certain design features to spread across distant communities, while others argue that similar shapes emerged independently in response to similar landscapes. You walk toward the edge of the clearer in snowshoes, crunching softly with each step. The forest ahead looks dense branches, heavy with frost. Without this tool, such terrain would be nearly impassable in winter. With it, you move steadily, conserving energy that would otherwise be wasted lifting your legs from drifts. Nearby, a sled rests against a tree. Its runners are smooth and slightly curved, designed to glide across packed snow. You run your hand along the wood and imagine it loaded with firewood furs or freshly caught fish. In some regions, dog teams transformed sleds into efficient transport systems capable of covering vast frozen distances. In others, people pulled smaller sleds themselves for short hauls. A small but intriguing historical note surfaces. In certain northern cultures, sled runners were sometimes treated with ice or even frozen fish skin to reduce friction, creating a slick surface that improved glide. It sounds almost whimsical yet practical in its own way. Winter ingenuity often involves embracing materials that seem unlikely at first glance. You glance toward a set of traps carefully arranged near the tree line. Winter hunting does not rely solely on direct pursuit. Trapping becomes particularly effective when animal paths are predictable against snow. Simple yet clever devices crafted from wood and sinew operate quietly while you remain sheltered. Another firmly recognized reality is that tools for winter travel often included layered footwear systems. Removable inner liners allowed boots to dry thoroughly overnight, preventing moisture from freezing. You recall how you warmed your boots by the fire, and realize how essential that practice is when tools must function reliably day after day. There remains thoughtful academic discussion about how early European settlers adopted snowshoes from indigenous peoples after struggling in deep snow. Written accounts describe astonishment at how efficiently native travelers moved across winter landscapes. What appeared effortless was, in fact, the result of accumulated expertise. You pause and look upward. The sky is pale, the sun a distant disk offering little warmth, yet you do not feel helpless in this environment. Each tool you hold transforms winter from obstacle into navigable terrain. You bend to examine a set of ice chisels used for cutting fishing holes. Their edges are shaped carefully, neither too blunt nor too sharp. Too much force would crack surrounding ice unpredictably. Precision matters. A curious anecdote appears in historical records, describing how some communities could estimate ice thickness by colour and sound alone, tapping lightly to hear tonal differences. That sensitivity to environment borders on musical awareness. You walk back toward the dwelling, snowshoes lifting and settling in steady rhythm. Inside the fire glows steadily, and someone begins repairing a tear in a binding with practiced hands. Tools are maintained constantly, not left to deteriorate. Researchers continue to examine preserved artifacts to better understand craftsmanship techniques. Microscopic analysis of tool marks reveals careful shaping and finishing. These were not hurried creations, they were refined instruments shaped for survival. You remove the snowshoes and lean them against the wall. Without them, the journey across even a short distance would have drained your strength quickly. With them, you return energized rather than exhausted. You realize that heating without modern systems depends not only on generating warmth, but on preserving energy. Efficient travel reduces fatigue. Well-maintained tools prevent accidents that could expose you to prolonged cold. As you settle near the hearth once more, you glance at the array of winter implements arranged neatly along the wall. Snowshoes, sleds, traps, chisels, each one a quiet testament to adaptation. Outside, the snow lies deep and sing. Inside, knowledge takes physical form in wood, sinew, and bone. And as you feel the steady warmth of the fire against your hands, you understand that winter survival is not achieved by endurance alone. It is achieved by shaping the environment into something you can move through with confidence, one careful step at a time. The tools are set aside for now, resting neatly along the wall, and the rhythm inside the dwelling shifts again. You begin to notice something that has been present all along, but easy to overlook. Much of what keeps this winter life functioning does not happen out on the ice or in the forest. It happens here in the steady work of hands that rarely seek attention. You watch as a woman sits near the firelight, a hide stretched across her lap. With patient movements, she draws a scraper along its surface, removing the last traces of membrane. The sound is soft and repetitive, almost meditative. Each stroke transforms stiff skin into something supple and warm. Without this labour, there would be no robes, no mittens, no lined boots. It is a well-established historical understanding that women in many Native American societies played central roles in winter survival through food, preservation, clothing production, shelter maintenance, and childcare. Their work did not always involve dramatic hunts or long treks across snow, yet it formed the foundation upon which everything else depended. You feel a quiet respect settle over you as you watch the steady rhythm of scraping and sewing. Nearby, another figure stirs a pot, adding carefully measured handfuls of dried grain. Steam rises, carrying the scent of simmering broth. Food does not simply appear in winter. It must be portioned, thoughtfully stretched wisely across weeks of cold. Decisions made here determine whether stores will last until thaw. There has been considerable scholarly exploration into how gendered divisions of labour functioned within Indigenous communities, particularly during winter months. While roles varied widely across regions and cultures, evidence consistently shows that women's expertise in processing, hides, preparing food and maintaining domestic spaces was indispensable. Without well-insulated clothing or reliable preserved meals, even the most skilled hunter would struggle. You glance toward a young girl sitting beside the woman with the hide. She watches intently, occasionally reaching out to hold a tool or test the softness of the leather. Learning unfolds quietly, woven into daily activity, rather than announced as formal instruction. A small yet striking historical detail appears in accounts from the plains where buffalo hides were transformed into heavy winter robes that required immense effort to prepare. Scraping, stretching, smoking to waterproof and preserve. The process could take days. You imagine the cold biting outside while hands inside work tirelessly to create warmth that would shield entire families. The fire pops softly and someone rises to adjust a seam on a parka laid across a sleeping platform. Even small tears are mended immediately. A gap in stitching during a winter hunt could allow wind to creep in, stealing heat at the worst possible moment. Another widely recognised reality is that food management during winter often relied on women's knowledge of portion control and storage techniques. Knowing when to open a sealed container and when to rely on dried fish or berries required foresight and restraint. You consider how easily abundance can disappear without careful stewardship. There remains thoughtful academic conversation about how early European observers often underestimated the complexity of women's labour in Indigenous societies, focusing instead on visible male activities such as hunting. Modern research has sought to correct that imbalance, highlighting the intricate skills embedded in textile production, hide tanning and food preservation. You notice a bundle of sinew being softened between fingers before being twisted into thread. The material tightens and strengthens as it dries, sealing seams against moisture. This is not idle handiwork. It is engineering performed by firelight. A curious anecdote recorded by explorers describes how some visitors attempted to replicate indigenous winter garments but failed to achieve the same warmth due to subtle differences in tanning techniques. The expertise required could not be copied easily without deep knowledge of materials. You shift closer to the warmth and feel the steady hum of activity around you. Winter may seem static from the outside, but inside work continues without pause. Hides are checked for dryness. Food supplies are inspected. Children's garments are adjusted as they grow. Researchers continue to examine preserved artifacts and oral histories to better understand how domestic labour sustained winter resilience. The evidence suggests that survival was a shared enterprise, though not always equally recognised in written records. You watch as the woman finishes scraping the hide and begins applying oils to soften it further. The smell is faint but earthy. She works methodically, aware that each layer she prepares will shield someone from biting wind. Outside, snow falls lightly again, whispering against the walls. Inside, warmth is built stitch by stitch, ladle by ladle. You realise that heating without modern devices is not solely about architecture or fire. It is about labour that transforms raw materials into insulation and nourishment. It is about attention to detail that prevents small problems from becoming dangerous ones. As you sit near the hearth and observe these steady hands at work, you understand that winter survival rests on countless quiet acts. The scraping of a hide, the mending of a seam, the careful counting of stored grain. The cold beyond the walls remains relentless, but within this space resilience is crafted patiently day after day by those whose work rarely makes a dramatic sound, yet shapes every warm breath taken inside. By midwinter, storms no longer feel like surprises. They are expected visitors, announced first by subtle changes in the air. You sense one coming long before the sky darkens. The wind shifts, carrying a sharper edge. Snow begins to fall in fine slanted lines, almost horizontal as the gusts strengthen. Inside the dwelling, movement becomes purposeful. Tools are brought in from outside. Firewood is stacked closer to the hearth. The entrance flap is checked and secured more tightly. No one panics. Preparation flows like a familiar ritual. It is a well-documented historical reality that many Indigenous communities developed keen observational skills to anticipate severe winter weather. Subtle cues in cloud formation, wind direction, and animal behaviour often signalled an approaching blizzard. You step outside briefly and glance toward the horizon. The clouds are thickening low and heavy. Birds have vanished from open spaces. Even the air feels different, charged and tense. You return inside as the first true blast of wind strikes the outer wall. The structure absorbs it with a muted thud. Snow swirls around the entrance, beginning to pile against the base. There has been sustained scholarly examination of how winter dwellings were reinforced during storms. Snowbanking around walls was not only insulation but also protection against structural damage. In some regions, additional supports were placed along windward sides when particularly strong storms were expected. The dwelling was not static. It was responsive. You watch as someone packs snow deliberately against a weak seam near the base of the wall. The snow hardens quickly in the cold, forming a temporary seal. Another person adjusts the smoke vent slightly, ensuring that wind does not drive smoke back inside. A small yet fascinating detail appears in historical accounts from Arctic regions. During fierce blizzards, entrances to snow houses could become completely buried. Inhabitants would dig small emergency tunnels from within if necessary. The idea of being sealed under snow sounds frightening at first, yet those inside often remain safer beneath the insulating drift than exposed to open wind. The storm intensifies. The wind roars now, carrying snow that rattles against the walls in a constant hiss. Inside, the fire burns steadily, its glow unwavering. You feel the contrast deeply. Outside chaos, inside controlled warmth. Another widely recognized reality is that blizzards often required complete suspension of travel. Hunting parties remained sheltered. Supplies gathered earlier in the season became essential. This is where foresight proves its value. Stored food, stacked, wood-well-insulated clothing. Storm endurance depends on preparation long before the first gust arrives. There remains thoughtful academic discussion about how severe winter storms influence social cohesion. Being confined together for extended periods could either strengthen bonds or strain them. Oral histories suggest that storytelling, song and ritual helped ease tension during forced confinement. The psychological dimension of storm survival mattered as much as the physical. You sit near the hearth and listen to the storm batter the walls. The sound is immense, like a living force pressing against the village. Snow piles higher, thickening the insulation further. You imagine the settlement slowly disappearing beneath drifts, transformed into a cluster of rounded shapes barely distinguishable from the landscape. A curious anecdote recorded by early travellers describes how some indigenous guides would lie flat on the ground during whiteout conditions to detect slight changes in wind direction by feel alone. Such sensitivity seems almost otherworldly, yet it reflects intimate knowledge of environment. Inside, the fire is tended carefully. Too large a blaze risks consuming precious wood too quickly. Too small and the interior grows uncomfortable. The balance is maintained even as the storm howls. You notice how everyone remains calm. Children are guided toward quieter activities. Elders sit close to warmth. The sense of shared endurance fills the space. Researchers continue to analyze archaeological evidence of winter storm impact on settlements. Layers of compacted snow around ancient structures reveal how often and how heavily storms struck. Yet the persistence of habitation shows that communities adapted successfully. The wind screams briefly through a narrow gap before someone quickly seals it with an extra hide. The draft disappears almost immediately. Vigilance is constant but not frantic. Hours pass. The storm reaches its peak, then slowly begins to ease. The roar softens into a low moan. Snow continues to fall, but without the violent gusts. You step toward the entrance and carefully lift the flap. A wall of white greets you, snow nearly level with the lower edge. The world has been reshaped again, smoothed into gentle curves. You feel a quiet sense of triumph. The dwelling stands firm, the fire still glows. Food remains stored, clothing remains dry. And as you settle back into the warm interior, you understand that surviving freezing winters without modern heating is not about avoiding storms. It's about enduring them with preparation, calm and knowledge. Outside, the land lies buried beneath fresh snow. Inside, warmth persists, held steady through foresight and collective effort. The storm passes, the fire remains, and winter continues patient and vast. When the storm finally loosens its grip, the world outside feels newly formed. Snowdrifts rise like soft walls around the village, reshaping familiar paths into gentle slopes and hidden hollows. You step carefully through the narrow opening, cleared from the entrance, and blink against the brightness. The air is still now almost startlingly calm after the roar of the night before. As you look across the white expanse, you begin to consider something less visible than snow or shelter. Not every material needed for winter survival could be found in one place. Even in the depth of cold months, networks of exchange continued weaving connections across distances that might seem impossible in such conditions. It's a well-established historical reality that trade routes existed across North America long before European contact, linking communities through the exchange of goods such as furs, dried foods, stone tools, shells, and pigments. Winter did not entirely halt these networks. In some cases, frozen rivers and lakes created smoother travel corridors than muddy summer ground. You imagine a small group setting out across packed snow sled runners gliding over the surface carrying bundles of carefully prepared hides. In return, they might bring back materials not available locally, perhaps a specific type of stone ideal for tool-making or furs better suited for extreme cold. Survival, then, was not isolated. It was interconnected. There has been sustained academic discussion about how extensive and organized these winter trade networks were. Some scholars suggest that certain routes were well established. Seasonal paths traveled regularly when conditions permitted. Others argue that severe weather limited exchange during the harshest periods, making stored goods and local resources more critical. Evidence from archaeological findings supports both views depending on region. You walk along the edge of the settlement and notice a visitor's sled near one of the dwellings. Its runners slightly different in design from those you saw earlier. The bindings appear tied in an unfamiliar pattern. Such subtle differences hint at exchange beyond this immediate group. A small but captivating detail from historical accounts describes how some Arctic communities traded seal oil and marine products with inland groups in exchange for caribou hides and stone tools. The cold itself besto shaped these exchanges. Marine resources thrived in icy seas, while inland herds provided materials uniquely suited for garments. Each environment offered something the other lacked. You brush snow from a stacked bundle near the entrance of a dwelling, and see that it contains furs distinct in colour and texture from those common here. Perhaps they arrived recently, carried carefully across miles of frozen terrain. You imagine the quiet negotiations that accompanied their arrival, words exchanged over shared meals, mutual recognition of necessity. Another firmly recognized point is that winter trade was not purely economic. It reinforced alliances, maintained kinship ties, and allowed knowledge to circulate between communities. Stories of weather patterns, hunting successes, and new techniques traveled alongside physical goods. In this way, heating and survival strategies themselves could spread through conversation. There remains thoughtful, scholarly reflection on how climate variability influenced trade frequency. During especially severe winters, as exchange may have become riskier yet more essential, particularly if local supplies dwindled. Archaeological layers sometimes reveal sudden influxes of non-local materials that suggest adaptive responses to hardship. You picture a group arriving after days of travel, faces windburned but determined sleds laden with carefully wrapped items. The welcome would not be casual. Hospitality in winter carried deep meaning. To share warmth and food with travellers was to affirm mutual dependence. A curious anecdote from early observers recounts how certain trade items were so valued that they were used sparingly throughout winter, saved for the coldest nights. Particularly thick fur from a distant region might be reserved for elders or newborns. Such choices reveal the delicate calculations behind survival. You step back inside and feel the familiar wave of heat from the hearth. A visitor sits near the fire, removing snow-encrusted boots, steam rising as they thaw. Their accent in speech may carry subtle differences, their clothing stitched in patterns not native to this village. Yet they sit within the same circle of warmth. Researchers continue to examine how long-distance trade influenced cultural adaptation in cold climates. The exchange of materials could alter clothing styles, shelter construction, and even dietary practices. Survival techniques were not static inventions, but evolving practices shaped by interaction. You sit quietly and listen as hosts and guests share news of distant lands. Perhaps a river froze earlier this year. Perhaps herds migrated differently. Such information can shape decisions weeks later. Outside, the snow remains deep and brilliant under the clear sky. Inside, warmth gathers not only from fire, but from connection. You realize that surviving freezing winters without modern heating was rarely a solitary effort. It involved networks that stretched beyond immediate horizons. Materials, knowledge, and support moved across frozen ground, binding communities together against the cold. As you watch the visitor lean closer to the fire, hands extended toward the glow, you understand that winter resilience is strengthened through exchange. Heat flows from hearth to traveller, from traveller to hearth, carried along invisible lines of relationship as steady and vital as any flame. The visitor's boots have dried by the hearth, and conversation has softened into a quieter rhythm. Outside, the storm's aftermath lingers in high drifts and glittering crusts of ice. Inside, you begin to notice another layer of winter survival that hums gently beneath daily tasks. It is the quiet tending of bodies strained by cold. You watch as an elder unwraps a small bundle of dried leaves and roots tied carefully with fibre cord. The scent that rises is sharp and earthy, different from the smoke of the fire. A pot of water is set near the coals, not to boil vigorously, but to warm slowly. Steam curls upward, carrying the fragrance of crushed herbs. It is a broadly recognized historical reality that indigenous communities across North America developed extensive knowledge of medicinal plants suited to their local environments, including remedies for ailments intensified by winter conditions. Cold air dries skin and cracks lips. Persistent dampness can irritate lungs. Frostbite threatens exposed flesh. You realize that warmth alone does not guarantee comfort. Health must be maintained deliberately. The elder dips a cloth into the herbal infusion and presses it gently against a child's reddened cheeks. The warmth is soothing rather than hot. You notice how careful the pressure is, how measured the movements are. Care here is not rushed. There has been considerable scholarly exploration into traditional winter medicines, from teas brewed to ease coughs to salves made from animal fat and plant extracts to protect skin from chapping. Some remedies were preventative applied before venturing out into harsh wind. Others treated symptoms after exposure. You rub your own hands together and imagine applying a thin layer of rendered fat mixed with crushed herbs along your knuckles, creating a barrier against dryness. It may sound simple, yet it forms a shield against the constant assault of icy air. A small but intriguing detail appears in ethnographic accounts from northern regions where certain lichens and mosses were used to line boots not only for insulation but also for moisture control. These natural materials absorb dampness, keeping feet drier during long winter treks. You picture gathering such materials during milder seasons and storing them carefully for later use. Another firmly established point is that winter diets rich in animal fat provided not only calories but also nutrients that supported skin health and immune strength. What you eat influences how well you withstand cold. You feel the connection between the steaming broth you consumed earlier and the steady warmth in your limbs now. There remains thoughtful academic discussion about how traditional medicinal knowledge was transmitted and how much of it was lost or altered after European contact disrupted communities. Oral traditions carried precise instructions for identifying, harvesting, and preparing plants. Some of that wisdom survives in contemporary indigenous practices, while other details have faded into fragments. You notice someone adding a handful of dried bark to the pot, the scent shifting subtly. Perhaps it is willow, known in many regions for its pain-relieving properties. You consider how knowledge of plant chemistry existed long before laboratory isolation of active compounds. Outside the air remains crisp and biting. Inside, the herbal steam moistens the dry atmosphere, slightly easing throats irritated by smoke and cold. The balance between dryness for warmth and moisture for comfort is delicate. A curious anecdote from early travellers recounts how some newcomers dismissed indigenous remedies as superstition only to adopt them later, when their own treatments failed in severe winter conditions. The land offers solutions to those who observe closely. You glance toward a hunter seated near the wall, examining a pale patch on his fingertips. The elder applies a different preparation there, perhaps to prevent frostbite from worsening. The attention is immediate and matter of fact, no dramatic alarm, just practiced response. Researchers continue to investigate the pharmacological properties of plants used traditionally in the cold climates, discovering measurable benefits in some cases. Yet beyond chemistry lies something deeper. Care itself warms the spirit. You inhale the herbal steam and feel your sinuses clear slightly. The scent is grounding, almost forest-like. It connects the interior space to the woods beyond. Another well-recognized aspect of winter medicine was the importance of rest. During periods of extreme cold or illness, reducing physical exertion preserved energy. The communal nature of the dwelling allowed others to take on additional tasks temporarily. Support was shared. You look around the room and notice how attentive everyone seems to subtle changes in one another's condition. A cough does not go ignored. A stiff gait is observed and addressed. Winter magnifies small weaknesses, so vigilance becomes habitual. As the pot is removed from the fire and the herbal bundle carefully wrapped again, you sense how this knowledge forms another layer of insulation, not against wind but against decline. Outside, the snow reflects pale light into the dwelling. Inside, warmth persists, bolstered by careful tending of both fire and flesh. And as you sit there breathing in the faint trace of herbs, you understand that surviving freezing winters without modern heating also required sustaining health through knowledge rooted deeply in place. The cold presses constantly at the edges of life. Wisdom pushes back quietly and steadily, one careful remedy at a time. The scent of herbs lingers softly in the air long after the bundle has been tied and set aside. You feel the steady pulse of warmth in the dwelling, not only from the fire, but from the layered presence of people and animals who share this space of survival. Near the entrance, a dog lifts its head ears, twitching at some distant sound beyond human hearing. Its thick fur ripples as it stands and stretches claws, clicking lightly against the packed earth floor. You notice how naturally it moves between inside and outside, pausing only briefly before pushing its way through the flap into the cold. It is a well-established historical understanding that animals, especially dogs, played a central role in winter survival for many indigenous communities. Dogs were companions, guardians, hunters, and in northern regions, vital transport partners. You step outside and watch as the dog bounds across the snow, its paws barely sinking. In Arctic areas, dog teams transformed winter travel, pulling sleds over vast stretches of frozen terrain. Their endurance and strength allowed families to transport supplies efficiently when snow depth made foot travel exhausting. You imagine the rhythmic sound of runners sliding across ice, the synchronized breathing of animals working together. There has been sustained scholarly research into the domestication and breeding of dogs in northern North America, tracing genetic lines that reveal adaptation to extreme cold. Thick double coats, compact bodies, stamina, shaped by generations of selection. These were not random companions, they were partners shaped by climate. The dog returns muzzle dusted with snow and shakes vigorously before slipping back inside. You feel a brief spray of cold droplets against your sleeve. The animal circles twice before settling near the doorway where cooler air lingers. Even in rest, it occupies a transitional space between warmth and frost. A small but fascinating historical detail emerges from accounts of some plains communities where dogs were once used to pull simple sled-like frames, long before horses arrived. In winter, these frames could slide over snow carrying goods and even children. The ingenuity of using available animals for transport reshaped daily life. You crouch and run your hand gently along the dog's thick fur. It feels dense and resilient, trapping heat close to its skin. You realize how much knowledge is embedded in observing animals, watching how they conserve warmth, how they seek shelter, how they move across snow. Another firmly recognized point is that animal behavior often served as an early warning system for approaching storms or shifting weather. Sudden restlessness, unusual quiet, changes in movement patterns. Attentive communities learn to read these signals. The dog by the door may know something you do not. There remains thoughtful academic discussion about how deeply intertwined human and animal survival became in winter environments. Dogs required food, which meant allocating precious resources, yet their labor and protection justified the investment. The relationship was reciprocal. You notice a bundle of dried fish set aside, perhaps partly intended for the animals. Even in scarcity, provisions are shared strategically. A well-fed dog can travel farther and pull heavier loads. Outside you see tracks leading away from the settlement, evidence of recent movement. Perhaps a small hunting group set traps earlier and now checks them with canine assistance. The snow preserves every step, every paw print, turning the land into a ledger of activity. A curious anecdote from early observers recounts how some indigenous sled dogs were trained to respond to subtle voice commands rather than reins navigating treacherous ice fields with precision. Trust between handler and animal was paramount. You step back inside and watch as a child reaches out to scratch behind the dog's ear. The animal leans into the touch, eyes half closed. Even this moment of affection carries practical weight. A calm, bonded animal is more reliable in the field. Researchers continue to explore how changes in environment and external pressures altered traditional animal partnerships over time. The introduction of new species shifting trade networks and imposed restrictions affected how communities relied on dogs and other animals. You sit near the hearth and listen to the steady breathing of both people and animals. The warmth in the room feels layered. Body heat from humans, heat radiating from the fire, the quiet presence of animals whose fur traps warmth and whose work extends survival beyond the walls. You realize that winter endurance is rarely solitary. It is collective, crossing species lines. The dog that trots through snow, the hunted animal whose hide becomes a robe, the fish pulled from beneath ice. Each plays a role in maintaining warmth and life. Outside, the snow glows faintly under a pale sun. Inside, the dog lifts its head briefly at a distant sound, then settles again, confident in the shelter shed. And as you rest your hand on that thick fur and feel its steady warmth beneath your palm, you understand that surviving freezing winters without modern heating depended not only on human ingenuity, but on partnerships forged with the living world. Heat here moves through relationships as surely as through flame. The days seem to blur together, now stitched by routines that repeat with subtle variations. Yet there is one element of winter that you cannot ignore, no matter how well insulated the dwelling or how steady the fire: the darkness. You step outside just after what passes for midday, and the sun hovers low above the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the snow. It offers light more than warmth, a pale disk that drifts sideways rather than climbing high. In far northern regions, daylight can shrink to only a few fragile hours. You feel how time itself bends under such conditions. It's widely recognized that communities living in high latitudes adapted not only physically, but psychologically to prolonged winter darkness. Seasonal rhythms shifted, activities adjusted to limited daylight. You imagine how carefully tasks would be planned around these narrow windows of light hunting and travel timed precisely. You return inside and notice how the interior light shifts as the sun fades. Fire becomes more than warmth. It becomes illumination. Oil lamps flicker softly in some regions, carved stone bowls holding fat that feeds a steady flame. The glow reflects on faces, turning shadows into gentle companions. There has been considerable scholarly interest in how communities mark time during long winter nights. Without modern clocks or artificial lighting, the passage of hours could feel abstract. Some relied on the position of stars when visible. Others measured time by tasks completed, stories told, or the steady reduction of firewood stacks. Time became experiential rather than mechanical. You sit near the hearth and listen to the quiet murmur of conversation. A story begins not as formal ceremony, but as gentle distraction from the length of night. You sense how storytelling stretches the mind outward when the world outside feels closed in. A small but intriguing historical detail emerges from Arctic regions where the return of the sun after extended darkness was sometimes greeted with communal acknowledgement or celebration. The first glimpse of sunlight above the horizon carried emotional weight far beyond its physical warmth. You imagine the hush that would fall as the sun reappeared after weeks away. You notice how children adjust naturally to the dimness playing in the firelight as though it were broad daylight. Their sense of time is shaped by rhythm rather than clock faces. Another firmly established reality is that winter darkness influenced sleep patterns. Some communities may have rested more during the longest nights, rising and sleeping in cycles that aligned with fire tending and shared activities. Modern research into circadian rhythms suggests that human sleep can adapt to extended darkness when not constrained by artificial schedules. There remains thoughtful academic discussion about the psychological impact of prolonged winter on pre-industrial societies. While isolation and darkness could weigh heavily, strong communal bonds and cultural practices often mitigated feelings of despair. Social cohesion functioned as insulation for the mind. You glance toward the doorway where faint starlight now replaces the vanished sun. The sky is vast and clear, constellations sharp against blackness. Without city lights, the stars appear almost within reach. You feel a quiet awe settle over you. A curious anecdote from early explorers describes how some indigenous guides navigated winter landscapes at night using constellations as reference points, reading the sky with fluency that astonished outsiders. Darkness was not blindness, it was a map. Inside, the fire crackles softly, sending brief flares of brightness upward. The room feels smaller at night, more intimate. Voices lower naturally as though darkness invites quiet. You reflect on how modern life floods winter evenings with electric light flattening seasonal contrasts. Here, the deepening dark carries weight. It signals rest, storytelling, reflection. Researchers continue to examine how traditional winter practices sustained mental resilience. Rituals tied to the solstice, communal gatherings, and shared creative activities appear in many cultures, reinforcing a sense of continuity despite limited daylight. You lie back on your bedding and watch shadows ripple along the ceiling. The firelight dances gently, casting shapes that shift with each movement of flame. Outside, the world is potent and vast. You realize that surviving freezing winters without modern heating is not only about resisting cold, but also about embracing darkness, finding meaning in it, filling it with voice, memory, and connection. As your eyes grow heavier, the crackle of the fire blends with the distant hush of wind. Time stretches softly, measured not in hours, but in breaths and embers. And in that long winter night, you sense that warmth comes not only from flame or fur, but from the steady presence of others, sharing the dark, waiting together for the slow return of light. You wake before dawn again, though dawn feels like a generous word for the faint paling of sky that seeps through the smoke vent. The fire has settled into a low bed of coal, still alive, still warm enough to nudge back into flame. You rise quietly and notice something you have felt many times now, but only just begun to understand. The air inside the dwelling is warmer near the hearth, cooler near the entrance, yet never wildly uneven. It does not feel accidental. You begin to look more closely at how this space manages airflow without metal stoves, without ductwork, without thermostats whispering commands behind the walls. It is a broadly acknowledged historical reality that many indigenous winter dwellings were designed with sophisticated internal airflow patterns that conserved heat while venting smoke effectively. You glance upward at the smoke opening and then toward the low entrance tunnel. Warm air rises, smoke escapes, cold air settles lower. The architecture cooperates with physics rather than fighting it. You move toward the entrance and crouch, feeling how noticeably cooler the air becomes near the floor. In some Arctic snow houses, entrances were built lower than the main living platform, creating a cold trap where heavier chilled air could gather without flooding the central space. You imagine stepping down into such a tunnel then, up into a surprisingly warm chamber above. There has been careful scholarly examination of these airflow systems through experimental reconstructions. Researchers have built replica snow houses and earth lodges to measure temperature gradients and smoke movement. Some findings suggest that interior temperatures could remain significantly above freezing, even when outside air plunged far below. Others caution that results varied with maintenance and occupancy. The conversation continues, shaped by both data and lived testimony. You sit again near the hearth and observe how the ceiling slopes gently. Rounded forms prevent smoke from stagnating in corners. Flat ceilings might trap pockets of stale air, but curves encourage circulation. You notice how even the shape of the room participates in warmth retention. A small but striking historical detail appears in descriptions of certain earth lodges on the plains. Central smoke holes were sometimes fitted with adjustable covers that could be shifted depending on wind direction. A simple movement of material could redirect smoke flow and prevent downdrafts. It is a quiet form of climate control guided by attentive hands rather than electronic sensors. You stretch your arms and feel the gentle warmth radiating from stones placed near the hearth. Thermal mass again. Heated gradually, they release warmth slowly as flames diminish. You realize that engineering here is not about intensity, it is about duration. Another firmly established point is that some longhouses in the eastern woodlands featured multiple hearths aligned along the central corridor, creating layered heat zones. Families slept near the warmth generated by their respective fires, and smoke drifted upward through openings spaced strategically along the roof. The length of the structure allowed heat to accumulate without overwhelming a single area. There remains thoughtful academic discussion about how much indoor air quality was compromised during prolonged winter confinement. Some argue that smoke exposure posed health risks, particularly in poorly ventilated spaces. Others note that frequent tending of vents and moderate fire sizes mitigated much of the danger. The reality likely varied across communities and conditions. You lean back and consider how modern heating systems often overcompensate blasting warmth that escapes through poorly insulated walls. Here warmth is coaxed, guided, preserved. Every structural decision reflects awareness of air's behaviour. A curious anecdote from early observers recounts how some European settlers initially dismissed indigenous dwellings as primitive, only to discover during harsh winters that their own drafty cabins with tall chimneys lost heat rapidly. Meanwhile, low-rounded lodges retained warmth with surprising efficiency. Appearances misled those who did not grasp the underlying principles. You run your hand along the inner wall and feel its solidity. Earth, wood, snow. Materials chosen not for ornament, but for their thermal properties. Insulation lies in thickness and composition rather than synthetic batting. Researchers continues to analyze airflow dynamics in traditional structures as using modern tools such as thermal imaging. The results often reveal patterns of heat retention that align closely with indigenous knowledge passed down orally for generations. What might seem intuitive today was refined through centuries of observation. You glance toward the doorway again. Each time it opens, a brief ribbon of cold air slides in along the floor before being warmed gradually. The design prevents sudden gusts from sweeping through the entire room. Even entry is engineered. The fire brightens slightly as you add a small piece of wood. Flames lick upward, then settle into steady rhythm. The smoke curls precisely toward the vent, not in chaotic swirls, but in guided ascent. You realize that heating without metal stoves does not mean absence of technology. It means technology expressed through architecture and attentiveness. The building itself becomes a system. Outside, snow rests quietly against the walls, reinforcing insulation. Inside, air moves gently, guided by shape and opening. As you sit there in the soft glow of morning embers, you understand that warmth here is the product of invisible currents shaped by thoughtful design. Heat rises, cold sinks, smoke seeks escape, and the dwelling answers each of these tendencies with subtle accommodation. The world beyond remains frozen and vast. Within these curved walls, however, warmth persists not through force, but through harmony with the laws of air and flame. You draw a slow breath, feeling the balanced temperature across your skin, and recognize that surviving freezing winters without modern heating required not only fire and fur, but architectural intelligence that turned physics itself into an ally. You sit quietly after tending the fire, watching the soft light flicker against the curved walls, and you begin to notice something else, a story you have carried with you without realizing it. A modern assumption. The idea that life before furnaces and radiators must have been constant misery. That winter meant endless suffering barely endured. You glance around this dwelling, people move calmly. A child laughs softly at something whispered near the hearth. Someone adjusts a fur lining with patient hands. There is work, yes. Vigilance, certainly. But there is not the frantic desperation your imagination once supplied. It's widely accepted among historians today that many popular images of pre-industrial winter life are shaped more by later narratives than by lived reality. Early European accounts sometimes described indigenous winter conditions in exaggerated terms, either to dramatize their own hardship or to portray native communities as pitiable. Yet archaeological and ethnographic evidence often reveals well-adapted systems that provided relative comfort within environmental limits. You lean back against a stack of hides and consider how easily the word primitive has been misapplied. The dwellings you have seen are not crude shelters thrown together in panic. They are carefully engineered structures aligned with wind patterns and insulated with layered materials. The clothing is not rough wrapping but tailored insulation. The food is not random scraps, but stored nourishment calculated to last. There has been sustained academic reassessment of how earlier historians characterized indigenous winter life. Many contemporary scholars argue that such portrayals underestimated the sophistication of environmental knowledge. Rather than existing in constant crisis, communities developed stable seasonal rhythms that integrated winter as one phase among many. You remember a curious anecdote from 19th century observers who visited northern communities and were surprised to find interiors warmer than their own poorly insulated cabins. The visitors accustomed to tall ceilings and drafty walls struggled more with the cold than those they presumed less advanced. Comfort, it turns out, depends on design rather than ornament. You rise and step toward the doorway, peering out at the snow-bright landscape. It is undeniably cold, your breath fogs instantly, the wind nips at your exposed skin. This is not a gentle environment, yet you no longer interpret it as insurmountable. Another well-documented reality is that indigenous knowledge systems were deeply empirical. Survival strategies were refined through observation, experimentation, and intergenerational teaching. The absence of metal stoves did not mean absence of understanding. It meant reliance on materials available locally. There remains thoughtful, scholarly debate about how climate severity fluctuated during different historical periods and how those shifts affected comfort levels. Some colder intervals may indeed have posed significant strain. Yet evidence suggests that communities adapted dynamically rather than passively enduring. You return inside and sit near the fire once more. The warmth is steady, not overwhelming. You think about your own home, where a malfunctioning heater can send panic through a household accustomed to uniform temperature. Here, warmth is relational. It depends on fire-tending clothing, maintenance, shared space, and collective awareness. A small but revealing detail appears in certain early missionary accounts that describe indigenous winter gatherings as lively and communal, filled with song and storytelling. These observers, expecting gloom instead, encountered resilience and cultural vibrancy. Their surprise speaks volumes about preconceived notions. You watch as someone lifts a pot lid and stirs its contents, releasing a wave of savoury steam. Winter meals are simple but satisfying. You recall how the broth warmed you from within. You recall how communal sleeping amplified warmth. You recall how snow itself insulated the walls. Researchers continue to challenge outdated narratives that equate technological simplicity with discomfort. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that reconstructed lodges, when built correctly, retain heat effectively. The lesson is humbling. You run your hand along the smooth curve of the wall and feel gratitude for knowledge shaped by land rather than industry. The dwelling may lack glass windows and iron radiators, but it is not lacking intelligence. Outside, the wind brushes gently against the snow-banked base. Inside, warmth gathers in layers of fur and flame. You realize that surviving freezing winters without modern heating was not a story of heroic suffering alone. It was a story of adaptation so refined that winter became familiar rather than terrifying. As you sit in the glow of the hearth and let the crackle settle into a soft rhythm, you feel your earlier assumptions dissolving like frost under sunlight. Winter remains vast. Cold remains real. Yet within these walls you sense that comfort can exist even without the devices you once thought indispensable. And in that quiet realization, you understand that the greatest insulation may be knowledge itself passed patiently from one generation to the next, turning what outsiders call hardship into a season lived with skill and composure. The wind outside has softened into a low murmur, and the village seems wrapped in a kind of suspended stillness. Yet even in this calm, you sense the quiet tension that winter can bring. Supplies must last, energy must be conserved, patience must stretch across weeks of cold. You sit near the hearth and watch how food is portioned carefully into bowls, no one taking more than needed. It is not a grim scene of scarcity, but there is unmistakable awareness. Winter can be generous or unforgiving, and communities must navigate that uncertainty together. It is well documented that cooperation was essential to survival in harsh climates. Many indigenous societies maintained systems of sharing that ensured vulnerable members were supported during lean times. Food, fuel, and clothing were not purely individual possessions, but part of a broader network of responsibility. You glance at an elder receiving a slightly thicker robe, perhaps offered quietly by someone who noticed a chill in their posture. There has been sustained scholarly exploration into how communal resource management functioned during winter months. Some anthropologists describe structured redistribution practices, while others emphasize informal reciprocity woven into daily life. In either case, cooperation formed a critical layer of insulation against hunger and cold. You notice how disagreements, if they arise, are addressed with calm voices rather than sharp ones. Winter confinement can magnify tension, yet open conflict would only weaken the group. Maintaining harmony becomes as important as tending the fire. A small but revealing historical detail appears in certain Plains accounts describing how successful hunters often shared their catch widely rather than hoarding it. Prestige was linked to generosity rather than accumulation. In winter, such values ensured that no family faced hardship alone. You shift your gaze toward the stored food containers and imagine a scenario where supplies begin to dwindle unexpectedly. Perhaps hunting yields less than hoped. Perhaps a storm delays travel longer than planned. How does a community respond? There remains thoughtful academic discussion about the balance between cooperation and competition in small winter settlements. While mutual support dominated human dynamics are complex, tensions could arise over resource allocation or leadership decisions. Oral histories sometimes recall difficult winters that tested bonds deeply. You look around the dwelling and observe subtle signs of leadership. An elder speaks and others listen attentively. Decisions about when to hunt, when to conserve wood, when to trade likely rest on collective consultation, but guided by experience. Leadership in winter carries weight. Outside, the snow reflects faint light back into the entrance. Inside, the fire continues its steady glow, a shared centre that unites everyone in a common circle. Another firmly recognised reality is that extended kinship networks provided resilience. Even if one small settlement struggled, relatives in neighbouring groups might offer support through trade or temporary relocation. Winter hardship rarely existed in isolation. A curious anecdote from early travellers recounts how some newcomers misinterpreted communal sharing as lack of ownership. They failed to see the intricate social agreements that governed who gave and who received. What appeared casual was often structured by deep custom. You watch as a child carries a small bundle of kindling toward the hearth, carefully placing it beside the larger logs. Even small contributions matter. Winter survival is collective, but it is also personal. Each individual participates. Researchers continue to analyse archaeological evidence of winter settlements to understand patterns of cooperation. Shared storage pits, communal hearths, and overlapping dwelling spaces suggest a level of integration that reduced vulnerability. You consider how easily modern households can become isolated units, each responsible only for itself. In a severe winter, the isolation can feel brittle. Here, interdependence strengthens resilience. A pot is lifted from the fire and food is distributed evenly. No one appears anxious. The rhythm of sharing feels natural. You realise that heating without modern systems relies not only on architecture and materials, but on social cohesion. A solitary fire in a solitary dwelling would struggle. A circle of dwellings bound by cooperation can endure far longer. Outside, the cold remains relentless, indifferent to human plans. Inside, warmth persists because people choose to act in concert rather than alone. As you settle closer to the hearth, feeling the gentle heat against your hands, you understand that winter tests not just physical preparation, but community strength. Conflict can fracture warmth. Cooperation multiplies it. The fire crackles softly, sparks rising and fading. Around it, people sit in quiet conversation, sharing food, tending clothing, watching over one another. And in that steady circle of shared effort, you sense that surviving freezing winters without modern heating depended as much on human connection as on any physical barrier against the cold. You wake to a morning that feels subtly different. The cold is still present, sharp and clear, yet there is a sense of change in the air, as though winter itself is not a fixed thing, but a shifting presence. You step outside and notice how the snow crust is thicker than it was days ago, hardened by alternating temperatures. The sky is a pale steel grey, promising either more snow or a brief brittle thaw. It becomes clear to you that winter is not identical from year to year. Some seasons are milder with manageable storms and steady supplies. Others press harder, stretching preparation to its limits. It is widely recognised among historians and climate scientists that North America has experienced periods of significant climatic fluctuation over centuries, including colder intervals, often grouped under the term Little Ice Age. During these times, winters in some regions grew longer and more severe. Indigenous communities living through such cycles did not possess thermometers or weather satellites, yet they responded through adaptation. You crouch and examine the snow more closely. Layers are visible where earlier falls compacted and refroze. Each stratum marks a shift in temperature. You imagine how elders might have read these patterns, noting whether snow came earlier than usual or lingered longer into spring. There has been sustained scholarly inquiry into how prolonged colder periods influence settlement patterns and resource strategies. Archaeological evidence sometimes reveals shifts in village locations, changes in diet composition, or modifications in dwelling construction that suggest adaptation to harsher conditions. The conversation continues as interpreting past climate from limited records requires careful balance. You return inside and observe how the dwelling feels slightly cooler this morning, perhaps due to a colder night. The fire is coaxed back to life with deliberate care. Wood must be used wisely, especially in extended winters. A small but intriguing historical detail appears in some oral traditions that describe winters so severe that animals migrated unpredictably, forcing communities to adjust hunting routes. Such stories are not mere folklore. They often encode memory of climatic stress passed through generations. You feel the weight of that memory as you sit near the hearth. Adaptation here is not a one-time invention. It is a continuous process. Another firmly established reality is that Indigenous communities often maintained flexible seasonal rounds, allowing them to shift camps or adjust resource use when environmental conditions changed. Mobility itself was a form of resilience. Fixed settlements, by contrast, can struggle when climate shifts beyond expectation. There remains thoughtful academic debate about the precise extent of temperature decline during colder centuries and how uniformly it affected different regions. Some areas experienced dramatic shifts, while others saw only moderate changes. Yet even modest fluctuations could alter migration patterns of animals or freeze rivers earlier than expected. You glance toward the storage containers and imagine what it would feel like to see supplies dwindling faster than planned because winter refused to loosen its grip. How quickly would plans adjust? Which families might relocate temporarily? Which trade routes would open? Researchers continue to examine tree ring data, ice cores, and sediment layers to reconstruct past climates. These scientific records, combined with Indigenous oral histories, provide a fuller picture of environmental variability. You step outside again and notice how the wind has picked up slightly, carrying fine grains of snow that skim across the surface like drifting sand. Winter breathes differently today. A curious anecdote recorded by early explorers recounts how certain communities maintained stories of legendary cold years, using them as warnings and guides for future preparation. Memory became insulation just as vital as fur or earth. You return inside and feel the fire's warmth against your palms. The dwelling stands steady, but you understand now that it exists within a larger changing system. Winter is not static, it's dynamic, shaped by broader climatic forces beyond human control. Survival without modern heating therefore required flexibility not only within a season, but across generations. You sit quietly and imagine elders recalling earlier decades when rivers froze differently or herds shifted paths. Such recollections would inform decisions in the present. Outside, the snow reflects a faint glimmer of light as clouds thin briefly. Inside, warmth gathers again around the revived flame. And as you listen to the quiet murmur of conversation near the hearth, you understand that enduring freezing winters demanded more than clever architecture and preserved food. It required awareness of patterns stretching beyond a single lifetime. Winter could be harsher one year and gentler the next. Communities that survived did so by observing, remembering, and adjusting. The cold presses steadily against the walls. The fire responds with steady light. And within that balance between unpredictability and preparation, you sense the quiet resilience that allowed generations to endure even when the climate itself shifted beneath their feet. You sit beside the hearth as the day drifts forward and your mind begins to wander not just through the present moment but through layers of time beneath your feet. The packed earth floor feels solid, yet below it lie traces of winters long past. Ash from earlier fires, fragments of bone, stone tools worn smooth by hands that faced the same cold centuries ago. It's firmly grounded in archaeological research that material remains from winter settlements provide detailed insight into how Indigenous communities endured harsh seasons. Excavations across North America have revealed hearths positioned centrally, storage pits lined carefully, and postmolds marking the outlines of insulated dwellings. You imagine a future archaeologist kneeling where you sit now, brushing away soil to uncover a circle of charcoal. You glance toward the wall and consider how even small details leave evidence. A discarded bone from a winter stew, a fragment of sinew thread, a broken snowshoe frame. These are not random remnants, they are records of adaptation. There has been sustained scholarly analysis of winter habitation layers, particularly in northern regions where permafrost preserves organic material with remarkable clarity. In some Arctic sites, archaeologists have uncovered entire sections of snowhouse floors and preserved tools frozen in place for centuries. Such findings allow modern researchers to reconstruct not only structures but daily routines. You imagine standing at an excavation site where ancient hearthstones remain blackened from repeated fires. Each layer of ash marks another night endured, another meal prepared. The accumulation tells a story of continuity rather than catastrophe, A small but captivating historical detail comes to mind. In certain frozen sites, archaeologists have discovered children's toys carved from bone or wood left behind centuries ago. Even in the depth of winter, survival play persisted. The cold did not erase childhood. You shift your gaze to the smoke vent above and picture how its placement might appear in a cross-section of soil long after the structure itself has vanished. Darkened patches where heat once rose. Subtle discolorations marking repeated use. Another widely acknowledged reality is that storage pits are among the most revealing archaeological features in winter settlements. Carefully lined and sometimes capped with insulating materials, they often contain remnants of preserved plant foods or animal bones. Their size and number hint at how extensively communities prepared for cold months. There remains thoughtful academic discussion about how to interpret certain winter features accurately. Was a particular pit used exclusively in winter, or did it serve multiple seasons? Did a cluster of hearths represent communal gatherings or successive occupations over time? Archaeology invites interpretation, and interpretation invites debate. You feel a quiet sense of connection to those who once tended fires in this same spot. Their hands warmed as yours do now. Their concerns about dwindling supplies or approaching storms echoed similar rhythms. Researchers continue to combine archaeological data with oral histories to create richer understandings of winter life. Oral traditions often preserve details that soil alone cannot reveal, such as seasonal rituals or the meaning attached to particular structures. You glance at a stone tool resting near the wall and imagine it centuries from now discovered beneath layers of sediment. A future scholar might hold it carefully, wondering about the hand that shaped it. A curious anecdote from early excavations in northern Canada describes how archaeologists were surprised to find evidence of carefully maintained drainage channels around some winter dwellings, preventing meltwater from seeping inside during brief thaws. Such sophistication challenged outdated assumptions about simplicity. You lean closer to the fire and watch sparks rise, knowing that each ember that falls will eventually become part of the soil's record. Winter survival leaves traces. It is broadly recognized that archaeological findings have reshaped modern understanding of indigenous engineering and environmental knowledge. Structures once dismissed as rudimentary are now studied for their thermal efficiency and adaptability. You picture layers of time stacked beneath you each winter, pressing gently upon the last. Ash becomes soil, soil preserves memory. There remains ongoing scholarly dialogue about how climate shifts over centuries can be read in settlement layers, revealing periods of expansion, contraction, or relocation. The ground itself becomes a chronicle of resilience. You sit quietly and feel the warmth against your palms. Above you, smoke drifts upward through the vent. Below you, centuries of winter endurance rest silently. And as you listen to the steady crackle of flame, you understand that surviving freezing winters without modern heating was not an isolated achievement of a single year or generation. It was a tradition layered across time, leaving evidence in earth and memory alike. The cold outside continues its patient reign. Inside, warmth endures, and beneath it all, the land remembers. The season has stretched long enough now that you feel winter, not as a sudden force, but as a companion that has walked beside you for weeks. The cold no longer shocks. It settles into the background of your awareness, something you respond to instinctively rather than fearfully. You step outside and notice that the light lingers a fraction longer in the afternoon. It is subtle, almost imperceptible, yet you sense it. The arc of the sun has shifted. Winter is still firm in its hold, but change whispers at the edges. You think about everything that has carried this community through the freezing months. Shelter shaped by wind and earth, fire tended with patience, clothing layered with knowledge, food preserved with foresight, tools crafted for snow and ice, stories that warmed long nights, cooperation that bound individuals into strength. It is widely acknowledged by historians and anthropologists that adaptability lies at the heart of indigenous survival strategies across diverse climates. Winter resilience did not depend on a single invention or technique. It emerged from an integrated system where architecture, diet, social structure, and spiritual practice reinforced one another. You feel that system surrounding you now, steady and layered. You kneel and press your hand into the snow. It is firm on the surface, softer beneath. The cold stings briefly, then fades as you withdraw your fingers. Your body has learned how to respond. Your mind has learned as well. There has been extensive scholarly reflection on the concept of resilience in indigenous societies, particularly in relation to environmental stress. Some researchers argue that mobility and flexible social networks were key. Others emphasize deep ecological knowledge as the primary factor. In truth, it was likely the interplay of many elements. You look toward the forest and imagine how knowledge accumulates not in books but in practice. A child learning to judge snow depth by sound. An elder recalling which valley offers shelter in fierce winds. A hunter recognizing subtle shifts in animal tracks. Each small skill contributes to a larger pattern of endurance. A small yet revealing historical detail comes to mind. In some northern communities, clothing was repaired so meticulously that garments could last multiple seasons with patches layered upon patches. The visual record of those repairs told a story of use and adaptation rather than neglect. You turn back towards the dwelling and feel the familiar warmth against your face as you re-enter. The fire burns calmly, its light reflecting on polished bone tools and carefully folded hides. Another well-established reality is that winter did not represent a pause in cultural life. Art continued. Songs were composed. Ceremonies were observed. Even in freezing temperatures, creativity persisted. Survival was not purely mechanical, it was meaningful. There remains thoughtful academic dialogue about how the concept of resilience can sometimes oversimplify complex histories, especially when external pressures, such as colonization, disrupted traditional patterns. Yet within the scope of winter alone, the evidence of adaptation is undeniable. You sit near the hearth and watch as someone gently rotates a stone closer to the fire, ensuring it stores warmth for later. The action is small, almost automatic. Habit has replaced conscious calculation. You realize that the true strength of this winter system lies in its integration. Remove one element and strain appears. Remove several and collapse follows. But together they create balance. Outside, the wind brushes lightly over the snow, no longer roaring as it did earlier in the season. The sky holds a faint brightness that lingers a moment longer each day. A curious anecdote from historical accounts mentions how some communities marked the subtle return of longer days with quiet acknowledgement rather than grand celebration. A nod, a story, a shared glance toward the horizon. The shift was gradual but deeply felt. Researchers continue to study how seasonal cycles shape cultural rhythms, reinforcing patience and long-term thinking. Winter required planning months in advance. Spring demanded readiness to move again. You stretch your hands toward the fire and feel the steady warmth sink into your skin. It feels familiar now, like an old friend. And as you reflect on the weeks behind you, you understand that surviving freezing winters without modern heating was not a matter of brute endurance. It was a demonstration of adaptability woven into every layer of life. The cold remains, but it no longer feels overwhelming. You have seen how knowledge turns frost into manageable challenge. You close your eyes briefly and listen to the crackle of the hearth, the quiet murmur of conversation, the soft rustle of fur against wood. Winter will release its grip in time. It always does. But even before the thaw arrives, you sense that resilience has already done its work. You wake to a morning that feels almost luminous. Not warm, not yet, but different. The light that filters through the smoke vent carries a softness you have not felt in many days. You sit up slowly, aware of the familiar weight of your robe, the steady presence of others rising around you, the faint glow of embers waiting to be stirred back into flame. You step outside and pause. The snow still blankets the land in every direction, but the sky above is clearer, a pale blue instead of steel grey. The air bites your lungs, yet beneath the sharpness you sense a shift. Winter has not ended. It has simply eased its grip. You look across the village and see the same dwellings that have carried everyone through the coldest weeks. Snow still banks their sides. Smoke still rises in thin threads from their vents. Yet there is a subtle energy in the way people move this morning. A glance toward the horizon, a longer look at the sun's path. It's widely acknowledged that for communities living in cold climates, the gradual return of longer days signalled more than just changing weather. It marked the turning of a cycle that shaped every aspect of life. You stand there and feel that turning quiet and steady. There were no thermostats to adjust, no furnace switches to flip. Winter warmth here has come from earth packed thick against walls, from snow layered deliberately along foundations, from carefully chosen furs stitched with skill from food, dried in summer sunlight and released slowly into hungry bodies. It has come from communal sleeping, from shared labour, from stories that fill darkness with meaning. You think back to the first moment you stepped into this frozen world, uncertain how anyone could endure such cold without modern heating. Now you understand that heating was never absent. It was simply different. It lived in architecture shaped by wind, in airflow guided by curved ceilings and low entrances, in thermal mass stored in heated stones, in animal fat burned steadily in lamps, in the slow combustion of calories within the body itself. Outside, a faint drip echoes from somewhere along the edge of a roof where sunlight touches snow for just a little longer than before. It is almost imperceptible, yet it feels monumental. There remains ongoing scholarly reflection on how seasonal cycles structured social life in Indigenous communities, reinforcing patience, preparation, and gratitude for incremental change. The return of light was rarely explosive. It unfolded gently, day by day. You walk slowly around the edge of the settlement and let your boots press into the crusted snow. Beneath the surface, it is still deep and cold. Winter has not surrendered, but you can sense its limits now. Inside, the fire burns calmly as ever. It does not blaze triumphantly at the hint of spring. It simply continues steady and reliable. That constancy feels profound. You sit once more near the hearth and allow your shoulders to relax fully. The air is dry and warm against your face. A child leans sleepily against an elder. Someone stirs a pot, steam rising in soft spirals. You reflect on the layers that have held this space together. Knowledge passed quietly from parent to child. Labour performed without subordinate. Cooperation that multiplied warmth. Adaptation refined across generations. Winter survival without modern heating was never about defying nature. It was about aligning with it, observing wind patterns, choosing settlement sites wisely, banking snow as insulation, rotating garments to keep them dry, sharing food so no one weakened alone. You feel a gentle sense of gratitude for the balance you have witnessed. The cold was real, the storms were fierce, yet the response was not panic, it was preparation. Outside, the light lingers a fraction longer again. The snow glows faintly under its touch. Somewhere beneath that white surface, seeds and roots wait patiently for their season. You let your breathing slow, matching the steady pulse of the fire. The crackle becomes softer, more distant. The voices around you blur into a low, comforting hum. The winter has not vanished, but it has been understood, managed, lived with rather than fought against. And as you rest in that awareness, while wrapped in warmth shaped by earth and memory, you feel the quiet truth settle over you. Human ingenuity does not always roar like a furnace. Sometimes it glows like embers, patient and persistent. Now as the light continues its gradual return and the cold softens ever so slightly at the edges, you allow your thoughts to drift. The fire is steady, the walls are strong, the knowledge is deep. Winter vast and silent begins to loosen its hold, and you, warmed by layers of skill and shared breath, can finally rest. Now let your mind slow even further. The snow outside is no longer something to conquer. It is simply there, resting over the land like a thick, quiet blanket. The wind has eased into a whisper, brushing gently along the rounded walls of the dwellings. Inside, the embers glow low and steady, casting a soft amber light that barely flickers. You feel the warmth along your hands, your face, your chest. Not blazing, not urgent, just enough. The stories have been told, the tools are set aside, the food is stored, the furs are mended. Every layer of preparation rests in its place. Beyond the walls, the frozen world waits patiently for spring. Beneath the snow seeds dream quietly of sunlight. Above the sky stretches vast and calm. You draw one last slow breath of dry, smoky air and let it out gently. The cold has been met with knowledge, the darkness filled with voice, the season endured with balance. The fire dims to a soft glow. The night settles, and you drift warm and untroubled into deep and peaceful rest. Sweet dreams.